Is that huge?
Nice job.
Tom, you want to call the school committee?
Yeah, since we're partial remote, I have to do a roll call as well, so I'll call the school committee to order. I believe in person we have Carla.
Here.
Yeah, Chuck.
We've got an echo now, everybody.
I believe in person we have Carla. Yeah, Chuck.
There's the TV on.
If we could ask the folks on Zoom to please mute yourself unless you're speaking. Thank you.
Okay, Aaron. I saw here, so I'll count that. Sean,
Here.
Sarah,
Here.
and Tom here. Thanks, Ed. We're called to order.
No worries, thanks. All right, thanks everybody. I'm just going to take this off so people can see my lips moving. Hi everyone, Ed Ross. I'm the chair of the of FINCOM. Just want to be able to welcome everyone to an early edition of the Financial Forum. We usually do these a little bit later in October, but we're doing an early one this year. Just for everyone's benefit, for the folks that are actually, no one in the room needs to hear this introduction, but this is for anyone else that's listening remotely or watching this on RCTV at a later time.
Recording in progress.
Now I should start again. They missed, yeah. One more gavel. Okay. You don't want to miss that. That's probably going to be the best part of this whole thing for me. So just as a, just for everyone else's benefit, just to give you a little bit of background on the Finance Committee. So we are a group of 9 Reading residents, and from kind of all kind of different kind of business and kind of financial backgrounds, and we are here to be able to view and discuss the budget and other financial matters, and and we advise town meetings on such matters. So again, as I was saying before, for the committee itself, we represent a wide array of financial backgrounds, and really at the end of the day, the main goal for us is to the common goal is for the kind of the well-being of Reading. So just as kind of one point, just want to be able to introduce the committee. First, the vice chair, Gene Borowski. I always have to we have to make a point of vice chair. I think I have a tick book. How many times I have to say it?
You really don't.
So yeah, Vice Chair Gene Borowski, and then new members, Jeffrey Coram, Joe McDonough, who is on participating remotely, and Jackie McCarthy are all new members. So again, welcome to your first Financial Forum. Please don't leave. Or you can't leave until it's over. And then returning members are seasoned veteran Eric Burkhart, Marion Downing, Mark Zarro, and myself. Again, and then just as kind of to talk a little bit about the forum itself. So this forum represents a kind of a kind of a key tenet that I think is shared both by school committee, the select board, town staff, as it relates to kind of financial matters, and that's really transparency. And so this fall review of the town and school budgets will happen in October, which is usually kind of part of the Financial Forum. This early edition is to review. Sharon's kind of is going to go through the federal grant funding, and then we'll also be coupled with this with a review of the kind of the long-term financial planning will be done by Bob on that side, and then with a specific emphasis on the updated kind of capital plan and current projects. I don't think this needs to be said, but anyone that's in here that's just to sign in there's a sign-in sheet that's, right outside the door, for anyone that's here. I also just wanted to be able to take a quick moment. This is, he's not on, is he on camera? He's probably not on camera, but this is Bob's first financial forum meeting. So I just wanted to be able to kind of, again, for me personally, just kind of recognize Bob as, I think this might be one of the reasons why. He's been answering a unbelievable amount of questions for me, giving me tons of guidance, especially as I kind of go through this. So really want to be able to thank Bob for all of his work, for the finance committee, and all the stuff he does for the town and staff as well. One other kind of piece, and again, someone maybe correct me. I'm thinking that it might be helpful for anyone that's going to speak in the room to use the mic.
Yes.
Just to make sure that everyone can hear you on both on the Zoom and then anyone that's watching in our RCTV. So it may kind of miss the cadence a little bit, but I can tell a joke or two, and while you make while you approach the mic. Kind of outside of that, I think we're kind of good to get started. The other kind of in the packet that we have as a FinCom meeting, just so you folks know, I think it's on page 2, has our meeting schedule. And while this is freshly printed, I think we already need to make some edits on it. So again, this is where one of many times I'm going to lean on Bob to make sure that I have this right. Our September 13th meeting is still booked, as well as, but I think our September 30th one is now on hold, and that October 20th, the second financial forum, again, that's still in our schedules. I don't know, Bob. Are we thinking about we possibly need to move that given schedules? Or?
I haven't studied the schedule carefully. It's, for those that don't know, meeting participants should have received an email yesterday explaining why a September special town meeting was just not going to work logistically for lots of reasons that were listed, which leaves us with the option of waiting until November or doing an October special town meeting. And I also listed some of the reasons why an October special town meeting might be helpful. And some of that is on decisions yet to be made. So it really depends, Ed. I think that according to the charter, the select board, according to their current meeting schedule, will close the warrant on September 14th for the November town meeting. If there is to be an October town meeting sometime in the middle of the month, they would also close that on the same night. So that your meeting on the 13th, you're welcome to do any other business, but it would be a little early for you to opine on the November or October articles until
Gotcha.
It's closed.
Gotcha.
So you might just consolidate that to September 30th if you don't have other business. Now, I'll also add that it's going to be a tight squeeze to do an October town meeting, get the warrant reports printed and distributed. We'll do it in-house, so it's faster. But we'd like to always have FinCom reports in writing, but that may not be possible this year. So we'll just try to do it as easy as possible.
Gotcha.
I think the rest of the schedule is good, though.
That sounds good to me. And then, unless there's any kind of questions from any of the kind of FinCom members on the schedule, I'll kind of open it up there. Any questions? Terrific. And then, so I guess with this, then Sharon, we'll start with you as far as giving the federal grant funding review.
Okay.
And as Sharon kind of gets ready and starts to share her screen, just again, another kind of housekeeping note, if we can, I know there's a lot of questions around it, and probably a lot of questions for Sharon. Let's, as a kind of a general, let's let her kind of run with it for a while, kind of get through the whole thing, and then, kind of pull the questions and do them at the end.
That would be easier.
Otherwise, because, my kids are going to school tomorrow, so I just want to be home for that
Yeah.
tomorrow morning. So I have a feeling that this may drag out a little bit if we tried to, ask a question every time it came up on a specific slide.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ed. So let's get to the first slide. So this is going to be a background and guidance on how the ARPA funds are intended to be used. So on March 11th, the President signed into law the American Rescue Plan Act, which is what we call ARPA. The law provides resources through the new Coronavirus Local Fiscal Recovery Fund to local governments to respond to the public health emergency caused by COVID. This fund is administered by the U.S. Department of Treasury. And so that we have, and just as a side note, we're not looking to have answers to what we're going to do. We just really want to give you the guidance of what it's supposed to be used for as we know it right now, and they could elaborate more. This is guidance summarized for you that came from the federal government. So the reporting requirements regarding ARPA is more my issue, but I figured I would share with you just so we all know. We are considered a non-entitlement unit, and so we are subject to different reporting requirements than a metropolitan city or county. And that would require that we don't have to do the interim report that metropolitan cities would have to do. But we are required to do an annual spending report, and it's due October 31st. This grant is actually for 5 years. It actually runs from March 11th to December 31st, 2026. So we have a long time to use this money. We have an annual report that will be due every October 31st. The first one's due this year, and it will run through September 30th. Any spending that we've done, we have not done any spending as of yet. And subsequent reports will be due on the 31st of October each year. So these are the funds that were awarded for Reading. There's two pieces. There's the municipal allocation, which is specific to Reading, and then there's the allocation for Middlesex County, which is reallocated out to all the communities that make up Middlesex County. We got a grand total of just under $7.6 million that will, for the 5-year period. This slide is just kind of a compilation of all the different COVID grants that we've received since the pandemic started, just to give us a feel for how much grant money we received. At the top is ARPA, and that's what we're going to be focused on, but we also received FEMA money, which I only show you kind of what we've received in reimbursement and what we're planning to submit. They did push back quite a lot to us, so it's hard to know how much FEMA is really going to pay us. The CARES grant is, and the FEMA grant, they work together. So the CARES grant would cover 25%, and FEMA was supposed to cover 75%, but I think we realized that FEMA had very strict parameters on what they were going to cover, so a lot more ended up going towards the CARES grant. And we do have about $500,000 left, scheduled to be used by October 31st. Actually, it's supposed to be December 31st, but this CARES grant is coming through the state. It's federal funding, but it's coming through the state. The state has asked us to get our report in by October 31st so they could see if there's any unused funding that they can reallocate across the state. So even though we have a deadline for December 31st, they've actually kind of cut us back a couple months. So whatever's unused, they could actually use in other parts of the state. Then there's the CARES grant for the school department. They have 4 grants. I summarized the amounts there, but there appeared to be 2 grants that were fiscal 21 and 2 grants that were fiscal 22, totaling about $2.2 million. So it looks like we've spent about half of it, which would make sense because we're in the beginning of fiscal 22. Same thing for COVID school meals. Looks like we used about half, and it was a fiscal 21 and a fiscal 22 grant. In the beginning of the pandemic, we received about $15,000 for a health grant, and then the rest in ambulance, and we expended all those funds. So we have about 12.4, just under 12.4 million, and we've expended about 3 million, leaving us with about 9.3, but the majority of that is this ARPA grant that we're going to discuss this evening. These are the eligible uses of the ARPA grant, and this is kind of broad. It's not, I'm going to have a separate slide for each one of these 5 parameters, or these 5 areas that they allow, but this is kind of a high level. The public health spending is for COVID mitigation efforts, medical expenses, behavioral health, and certain public health and safety staff. Then there's the economic impacts of the public health emergency, and that would cover efforts to mitigate economic harm to workers, households, small businesses, affected industries, and the public sector. Then we have the loss of public sector revenue. And this would be payments that we can use to fund our government services based on the loss of revenue that we saw based on the pandemic. And then there's premium pay. There are funds that we can use to pay additional pay to those who were faced with the greatest health risk, the essential employee that had to be on site, that couldn't be working remotely. They have to be somebody who's an essential worker, and they have to be on site. And then the water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. So we can use this to invest to improve our access to clean drinking water, support wastewater and stormwater infrastructure, and to expand our access to broadband internet. Two things that they absolutely don't want to see us try and use the funds for is for a rainy day fund or any kind of reserve fund, and we cannot make a deposit to our pension fund. So the piece of, the first piece is the public health response, and that pertains to how to mitigate the spread of COVID-19, and they give us several examples of what would be covered under this area. And there are some of them where we've been doing all along: vaccination programs, medical expenses, testing, contact tracing, isolation and quarantine costs, PPE purchases, support for vulnerable populations to access medical or public health services, public health surveillance, which is monitoring for variants, enhancements of public health data systems, enforcement of public health orders, public communication efforts, enhancement of healthcare capacity, including alternative healthcare facilities, support for prevention, mitigation, or other services in congregate living facilities and schools, capital investments in public facilities to meet pandemic operational needs, and ventilation improvements in key settings. Quite a mouthful. And then there's the other piece of the public health response, which was behavioral health care needs. And the examples that they're giving here are related to mental health treatment, substance abuse, behavioral health issues, anything in response to that: hotlines, warm lines, crisis center intervention. They saw a great increase during the pandemic of depression, anxiety, mental health crisis, substance abuse issues, that the numbers were skyrocketing, and so this is something that they consider to be an allowable response. Services or outreach to promote access to health and social services, and payroll and covered benefits for public health, healthcare, human services, public safety, and similar employees to the extent that they work on COVID response. So they'd have to keep track of how much time they're spending on a COVID response, and we could actually charge their payroll and their benefits to the grant. So addressing the negative economic impacts caused by the public health emergency. Some of the examples they give of things that we could be covered by is delivering assistance to workers and families. So unemployed workers, we could be providing job training. We could be providing aids to households that are facing food and housing and financial insecurity. In addition, these funds can support survivor benefits for family members of COVID-19 victims. So more supporting small businesses. We can help address our small businesses' financial challenges caused by the pandemic and make investments in COVID prevention and mitigation tactics, as well as preventing or providing technical assistance to achieve these goals. Recipients may employ this funding to execute a broad array of loan, grant, in-kind assistance, and counseling programs to enable small businesses to rebound from the downturn. More. Speeding the recovery of tourism, travel, and hospitality sectors. Some industries were hit harder than others, and these are ones that they give us an example, but other industries that would fall in this category could be eligible for support. Rebuilding public sector capacity. So we are allowed to rebuild our staff back to pre-pandemic levels. So if we had laid anybody off or furloughed people, we could bring them back and charge some of that back to this grant. Serving the hardest hit communities and families by addressing health disparities, investments in housing and neighborhoods, addressing educational disparities, and promoting healthy childhood environments. So they in the details that related to this, they talk about investing in low-income housing and things like that. Replacing lost public sector revenue. They give us kind of a guideline of how we would do that. So basically, they're telling us that we can fill some of our budget shortfalls if we have them with whatever lost revenue we may have experienced during the pandemic. So what we would do is we would actually provide our actual revenue compared to what our projected revenue would have looked like had we not had a pandemic. So we would use the average revenue growth that we would experience over the last 3 years that were prior to the pandemic, and we'd use that growth rate to see what our revenues would have looked like, and then we would compare them to our actuals. And that shortfall could be used, and we would have a broad range of uses that we could use it for if we chose that path. They also give you the option of just selecting the 4.1% national average, which is the growth rate from 2015 to 2018. So once a shortfall of revenue is identified, recipients have a broad latitude to use this funding. So it doesn't necessarily have to be COVID-related, where all the others seem to be pointing to an impact that we're looking to solve. Providing premium pay for essential workers, recipients may use funding to provide premium pay directly or through grants to private employers to a broad range of essential workers who must be present at their jobs. The Treasury emphasizes the need to prioritize premium pay for lower income workers. So they give you examples of who they consider to be essential workers: staffing at nursing homes, hospitals, home care settings, workers at farms, food production facilities, grocery stores and restaurants, janitors and sanitation workers, public health and safety staff, truck drivers, transit staff, warehouse workers, child care workers, educators, and school staff, social service and human service staff, and any work done remotely would not qualify. So under the premium pay, under these sections, we would be allowed to pay up to $13 per hour in addition to what they were already paid, up to a maximum of $25,000 per employee. And there's also a requirement that if the total pay for an employee exceeds 150% of the state's average annual wage, we would have to have written justification as to how that responds to the, the pandemic and how that was a good use of the funds. Investing in water and sewer infrastructure. That is, I've given you 4 different kind of points that they give us here. Recipients may use funds to invest in necessary improvements to their water and sewer infrastructures, including projects that address the impacts of climate change. We may also use it for an array of drinking water infrastructure projects, such as building and upgrading facilities and transmission, distribution, and storage systems, including replacement of lead service lines. We also may use it for wastewater infrastructure projects, including constructing publicly owned treatment infrastructure, managing and treating stormwater or subsurface draining water, facilitating water reuse, and securing publicly owned treatment centers. The rules seem to align with the eligible projects that are the wider range of projects that would qualify under the EPA's Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. So if a project would qualify under those two, they would qualify under this grant. And then investing in broadband. So there was a lot of discussion in the literature that I received that many Americans did not have sufficient broadband access. So this was something that they added to the grant, that the pandemic has underscored the importance of access of universal, high-speed, reliable, and affordable broadband coverage. 30 million Americans live in areas where there is no broadband access or where existing services do not deliver minimally acceptable speeds, and that millions of Americans either don't have, because of high costs, don't have broadband access. And so recipients should build infrastructure with modern technologies in mind, specifically those projects that deliver services offering 100 megabytes per second for download and 200 megabytes per second upload speeds. Recipients are encouraged to pursue fiber optics. And then also, if we were to identify people within the community that don't have broadband access, we could give assistance to households to support internet access and also digital literacy those are also eligible uses. So the big picture that I got from all that I read about the grant was that they wanted us to identify the impact in our community. Not everything is going to be the same in every community. And then use these funds to try and address the negative impacts that we're seeing in our community. And it should be related to the response for COVID in most cases. Where we have the loss of revenue, it could be non-COVID related. That's actually kind of filling a gap or a budget shortfall. You could use that money in that way. But most everything in some way, shape, or form is pointing back to the impact of COVID and trying to correct kind of some of what's gone wrong since the pandemic started. Okay, so that's all I have. Questions?
So why don't we start with, I guess folks in the room to start off, if there's any questions for Sharon. I had a couple, but I'll open it up to folks. Go ahead, Marianne.
Should I go to the mic or will I be great?
No, you should be fine. I think there's a mic close enough to you. Is there a mic close to you?
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, that, okay. So Sharon, when you mentioned we have 5 years to spend the grant, but yet we also are limited to spending it on impacts of COVID. So how do we know 5 years from now what a COVID impact, is it that we plan the expense now and can spend it over 5 years? How does that work?
I think that's what's up to us, is how do we think that it's going to best impact what we're seeing. I mean, if we're seeing people that are struggling with lack of food and maybe not being current on rent, then that's something that's an immediate need and a response. Something that's related to our infrastructure, related to water and sewer, might be a longer-term project, and we may not expend it right away. It might be something we start, and we may need it 2 to 3 years down the road, however long it takes us to do the work.
Okay, so we have to identify the need now. We can't just
We're
say,
not
well,
maybe
this is
looking
the
tonight to
need.
identify all the needs, but just to start thinking about what is the intent of this grant, what are they hoping for us to use it for, and how is our community impacted, and what is the best response for us? What are some of the things we're seeing in our community that are under these categories, and what would be the best path forward in terms of, mitigating what we're seeing? Is how do we get a better impact, like change with the negative impact, and we have to kind of plan how we use these funds based on, in our community, what the biggest concerns are.
Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, Ed. So Sharon, are we able to use the funding for the water tower project at all? That's kind of excluded because it's not a
That's a good question.
COVID-ish kind of.
It's not necessarily related to COVID, but they are kind of pointing towards clean water, and so it definitely is something we could question and see if there's some portion that we could charge to the grant, because they are pointing to a lot of things that qualify because they're looking to have clean water, clean drinking water, and that could be something that we could ask to, but I would want to confirm with somebody. That's kind of a little bit outside of what I was thinking, but that doesn't mean it's not something we could do.
And then in terms of the broadband, I guess, I don't know how everyone else would feel about that, because obviously we have BIOS here, anyone can get whatever they want. But in terms of downtown, small businesses kind of thing, I think that we'd be able to provide wireless internet to all of downtown, as well as the other 40Rs, 40Bs and whatnot, for relatively low cost associated with that. So I'm wondering if that's something that people would be interested in, because it would benefit the small businesses. It would theoretically, the people in low-income housing would also benefit from just having free internet, and it would make a much more vibrant downtown as well. So,
Yeah, I mean, they
something
definitely
else.
point to the lower income households that maybe can't afford to have the broadband access, how that limited their ability to do remote learning with their children, how it limited their ability to work remote, or they just had speeds that were way too slow to actually keep up with what needed to be done. And so that's definitely an area that across the country they saw issues with. I don't know if it's necessarily an issue that we have here, but certainly if we have households that don't have access to internet, that's something that we would be able to use as an eligible expense to provide that to households who can't afford.
Yeah, because we have a lot of telephone poles lining up downtown Olive Haven and whatnot, and you'd be able to light up so many different things with just a handful of access points, and it could really benefit everybody. in a sense.
Even the businesses, yeah, that
Yeah,
would make sense to
yeah.
me, yeah.
Good, Mark.
I don't know if you know this, Sharon, but is there somebody who's taken this as like the champion and putting together a list of all the potential projects?
I have a 134-page document that was sent to me, so somebody definitely has been working and thinking very hard about potential uses, and so I'm about 3/4 of the way through. But it's definitely something that, if you had an idea, we could figure out, does it fall into any of these buckets?
Yeah, but my question is somebody within the town.
Oh, within the town.
Going to pull it together that we can look at, all the.
I would think I would have to be one of those people, because I was asked to research what we can use it for. But obviously Bob, myself, department heads, those would be the people that I think would be actively involved in identifying what we might use it for. But I would imagine we're opening the conversation for the community at large to kind of identify what are the needs so that we plan accordingly.
Right, and then any idea of the timing of pulling together a list?
Well, this is our first meeting, so it's just kind of get the thoughts going, but I would imagine we would need to start thinking about it soon if we want to plan to do some things that are needed now. So, yeah. I mean, I don't know when we plan to start using it, but this was just kind of to introduce the topic, to introduce kind of what the intent is, the categories that they foresee this grant money to be used, and to start thinking about how was our community impacted by the pandemic and what can we do with this funds to kind of correct the situation.
Go ahead, Chuck. You're gonna have to walk quickly, Chuck. I mean, we can't be here all night. Thanks, Chuck.
Thank
He
you.
did jog. For everyone else, not watching, he did jog over.
So, my question isn't necessarily about project, Sharon, but, and I did see the bold print that we can't use this to replenish our rainy day fund, but is there any thought to using some of it for what we might otherwise use our rainy day fund for? So don't use the rainy day fund this year and use some of this instead.
Yeah, I think that you could do that, especially under that loss of revenue category, when we identify how much revenue we lost due to the pandemic, where we should have been, where we ended up being that difference. You could use that for a broad array of selections, and we could use that instead of free cash.
So early indications, I would be very interested in having that discussion.
It's a great question, Chuck. That's excellent.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Jean.
This actually kind of dovetails to what Chuck was just saying. As we're having this discussion, I guess I would encourage all of us, I don't even know who to address this to step back a little bit from like what projects might be covered and talk about what's the framework with which you make this decision, right? So then you look at the projects and sort of say, okay, like we agreed we were going to prioritize in this way. So a couple of ideas I jotted down, and one was one that you just brought up, Chuck. What has the longest term impact on the community? Because you've got a limited amount of money. It's a very generous amount of money, but it's limited. So you want to have the biggest bang for the buck, right? You don't want to put it at something that the benefit is gone in a year versus something where the benefit might go on decades. Another thought is ensuring that the issue you're addressing is really COVID related. Some of the issues we chatted about were, supporting small businesses or families who are in crisis. Important issues for sure. But if it's not really COVID related, if they're broader issues, we need a broader systemic community solution and not be looking at this money for that. And the other one was what you just said, Chuck, which is, if we've got existing plans that we otherwise would want to fund, this could open up more money for other capital projects. It could even potentially be used to support the operating budget down the line, because we're a little bit over FINCOM guidance for budget and debt for the next several years, if we wanted that flexibility in year 3 or 4. So I think off the top of my head, there's a lot of good ways to have these conversations, but I would be wary of jumping right into, here's what we might do with it. And instead of saying, well, what's the smartest way, you can make the decision. And that way, when you do go to town meeting and other members in the community and say, this is how we're going to spend this money, here's why. Here's the framework you use. Here's how we prioritized of all the things we'd love to do. Here's why these projects rose to the top. So that's just my truth. I probably have a lot more but off the top of my head, those are some things. But I really like that idea of thinking, before talking about individual projects, what's the right way to make this decision. And the broadband for families in the community, for instance, somebody, I think Chris mentioned that there might be families in the community who don't have access to internet. That's a long-term benefit, right? If you can find people who need that, that's going to benefit those families for a very long time.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? No. Thank you.
Go ahead, Karen.
Quick question, Sharon, I didn't know if you're far enough along in the process. In terms of identifying what our revenue shortfall was, is it like
I haven't
just-
even calculated
Okay,
it.
'cause it's like,
I'm trying to
you know,
wrap
we
up
would
the
like to
CARES
say it was only
grant.
220, but it
Yeah.
could be 220 and 221, so.
Yeah,
okay.
I mean, and it's interesting too, because I don't know if our revenue growth is at that 4.1%, so a lot of people might default to that 4.1%. I don't know if our revenue growth would average that high, but they're allowing you to just use that as a baseline if you wanted to use that number. So that could actually even produce a bigger shortfall than what we would have used if we used our average, so.
Go ahead.
Just completely jumping in on what you just said, I think Karen brings up a really good point. You know, I immediately went to excise tax, because didn't we see a big drop in excise tax? There was one area where there was a huge drop, but the obvious, you know.
And interest,
COVID.
yeah, our interest rates were a big drop, like we definitely saw a big reduction there.
Yeah.
And we definitely saw the excise tax went down, but it recovered a lot better than I expected. We weren't under as much as I would have. We were over what we projected, but we were less than what we were pre-pandemic. So we recovered a lot faster on the excise tax than I would have anticipated.
Yeah.
I mean, we're still below where we would have been, but we beat our projection, which I didn't expect that we were. We were very slow moving, and the last couple months, we actually got a couple commitments that were late. That the motor vehicles did not come in on time, so we had 2 or 3 commitments late in the fiscal year, and we got a lot of revenue at the end. So we ended up meeting projection where I didn't think we were going to, but we still are lower than what we would have been pre-pandemic. So.
And that exactly, my thinking on that is just sort of, if you were to decide to use the funding for that reason, really having confidence that that revenue is going to come back, because you could create a cliff otherwise, right?
Yep.
If you say, oh, you know, this revenue source went down, so we're going to plug it with this grant money, which will dry up over time. But well, you better be really sure that revenue source is going to jump back. I'd almost want to, so just something to think about.
Go ahead, Carl.
If I could encourage some focus on our senior population, it's my industry, and we have seen really the deterioration of a lot of these seniors in terms of their lack of being able to get outside. And I even know specifically in Reading and some of our assisted livings that seniors can't even get outside with a family member because they don't have a chair outside the assisted living, or they don't have an aide who can accompany them outside. So in terms of just mobility issues and that type of interaction, the senior population has suffered greatly during COVID, as well as the children. But that is such an easy fix in terms of having the appropriate aides and paying people a good enough wage so they want to come in and help and work. So short term and the benefits for these seniors, and additionally, those seniors who are at home as well. That interaction and the little things that we can do with this grant to really change their situation. So thanks.
I'm just going to, Mark and Tom have been, it looks like patiently waiting. I'm not sure. But there Mark goes. I'll start with Mark. Tom, he was a little bit more anxious than you were. So I'll go to Mark.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks for your patience, Tom. Great discussion. I think that one of the things I'd love for us to look at and think about with this money is really investment focused. So we're talking about kind of longer term benefits and things like that. Thanks for bringing up the notion on senior kind of programming and activity. But we also have some huge needs in terms of potentially facilities and just resources in general for seniors. And I really would like us to look, carefully into what those needs are, what some options are that we could address. The other big thing that has been striking me about this has been infrastructure. And so Sharon, one of the questions, and it's this kind of COVID-ish sort of question, they're talking a lot about clean water and getting lead and things out of pipes. And, old pipes often have lead. And we know we have some of those in town also. And I'm wondering if just the fact that, maybe it's been highlighted a bit more, the importance of clean water, that's enough to kick it into the category of, that seems like a reasonable potential use. So again, I'm in line with not saying here are my 5 priorities, it's, do this on that line. But I think it's kind of understanding what some of the areas could be. And I think that over time, we have some huge needs in infrastructure. And I just want to, maybe as you're asking questions, you're getting clarification on, for example, the water tank. We can ask some other questions here also about just water systems in general, replacing old pipes, replacing leaded pipes, things like that. Because I think those are investments this community is going to need no matter what. And I think the question is kind of when and how funded to some extent. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Go ahead, Tom.
So first, I want to echo some of what Gene was saying about putting in place a framework, really. I think there's so many different ideas. We need to figure out how we're going to stack rank them and make sure that we're spending the money properly, because we can just keep throwing ideas out if there's no filter to determine which ones make the biggest bang for the buck in the long run. Then we're just going to spend the money in some way and not have a real strategic thought about it. And in that mind as well, thinking of the strategic thought and looking at some of the categories, Sharon, that you put out there, as well as being aware of what another district recently did with this money and looking at it. I want us to think about some other things that we've been talking about as a town for a long time and see how best we can figure out if this fits in this category. In particular, we probably have more single income families now than we have had a long time because of COVID. And with the single income family comes a reduced ability to pay for full day kindergarten, which has been a long-term desire from a school committee perspective to be able to achieve. In addition, with the COVID related impacts from last year, we have many of our students who frankly people don't want to say it, but frankly are probably behind from where they should be, especially in the early childhood space. From a reading perspective and other things along those lines that are core foundational needs that they need in order to succeed going forward in their schooling periods. And there are other potential areas there that we could look at. The town I'm referring to in particular is Holliston. They were one of the 31 towns in all of Reading and all of Massachusetts that had a paid kindergarten plan until 2 weeks ago. And they're funding it over 5 years, proportionally with a step down plan to get out of full day kindergarten with this money in particular. That's one of the uses that they have going forward in there. So I think there's some other creative uses that we can think about and long-term positive impacts that we can tie from an economic impact for some of our lower income families, as well as a learning loss perspective from our student perspectives. There are probably other cases I could go on and put some other things on there, but I really think that we want to put in place the process. One of the things Holliston did, again, is they created a committee that looked at this across select board, school committee, other town boards as necessary, in addition to the town accountant, maybe the chief financial director of the schools, et cetera. What are the options? Put it into that funnel, filter down, and then choose the top 5 or whatever the case may be that would use the money effectively and efficiently, and that the town overall could get behind, not just the collective 20 of us that are in the room. So thank you.
So I think that idea about having some type of a subcommittee is really a great idea. And at least being able to help bucket things, categorize them, and then you apply your weights to them. There's a lot of things that and having it kind of focused into kind of a smaller committee, I think allows it to be able to be a little bit more functional, and help marry what the priorities are, et cetera. I think it's a great idea, Tom. I let you go first. I think I was going to propose that too, but I'll give you the credit. Sean, I saw your hand up too, and I'll go back to you.
Thanks, Ed. So first, I just want to endorse everything that Tom just shared. I think the Holliston model is a really thoughtful one, and I imagine Tom can share some of the details that he received from them with folks to think about and consider. One other one I'll throw in, and I also agree with some of the things that Tom highlighted in terms of thinking about a path to, full day K or reduced tuition for full day K, as well as investment in early literacy in particular. There's another one on the other end of the spectrum from a school's perspective that I think would be relevant, would probably fit into the guidelines, which is in the actual federal rule. One of the things it highlights and calls out as an impact of COVID is that rates of unemployment are particularly severe among workers of color and workers with lower levels of educational attainment. And it goes on to give some examples. One of the antidotes for providing career paths and career options and income stability for people of lower levels of educational attainment is vocational training. And this is something we've talked about as a need in our schools for a long time, but as a ongoing pain that may be caused by COVID and may accrue disproportionately to certain socioeconomic groups. I think that's one that we might want to think about as an investment potential as well.
Thanks, Sean. Anybody else? Did I miss anybody? Or any kind of follow-up questions to what's been shared already? Am I missing anybody online? Sharon, I just
down there.
Ed, go ahead, Marianne, go ahead.
Just one follow-up thought on where, let me just check my notes, where we're talking about the supplementing the low-wage workers and providing that's one allowable use. One issue we had during COVID, and I don't know if it's going to be ongoing, is we pay our substitute teaching staff and a lot of our substitute teaching staff and substitute paras, which affect our education every day. They get less than state minimum wage. And we've had a very hard time. I think last year you had principals filling in the classes. And I think our paras don't make a lot. So as we think about, I mean, it wouldn't take, I don't know how this works.
All of the collective bargaining, we were raising this last year, and the previous superintendent said, well, everything has to be worked out with the unions. But if that's something that's going to have a long-term impact. It may not use much of the grant, but it's going to be, if there's any more COVID cases or COVID outbreaks, these are frontline workers that you can't get because we're paying them less than, someone working in a sub shop downtown. So I think that's something that it impacts the whole school system, and it's, a lot of people don't realize how little those workers get paid. So it's just a thought.
Thanks, Marianne. Sharon, I just had a couple, Tom, do you have your hand back up again, Tom?
Just to kind of answer that real quick, Ed, if you
Yeah,
want.
sure, go ahead.
I did bring that up during
Other conversations, that is not a union negotiation. That is just something we would have to do appropriately. But I agree with Marianne that this is a potential use for that. To at least on the short term raise that and build up something in that space. It would not have a long-term benefit, for lack of a better way, other than closing the gap right now. So it is something we can think about. I would put in that category, think like tutoring services as well, to help close some of the educational needs as more of a tactical as opposed to a strategic spend, but something that's definitely worth considering in the context here.
Sharon, just maybe just a logistical type of question. So, like for the ARPA funds, kind of specifically, is there a are you going to have to account for it and set up a separate account and have it, where you have to kind of report back? So it's not like it automatically gets dumped into free cash. You know what I mean? Like, from I know that, but
set up separately, and everything that we charge, all the revenue would go in there, and all the expenses related to how we expend it would be in there. And so that would be what I'd use to do their yearly report.
Gotcha. And then kind of similar, and again, I don't know necessarily if this is, a question for you, Sharon, but just in general, on one of the slides you had, something about, kind of health response and, and I know there was, a lot of it from a mental health and perspective. Again, Chief, I don't know if this is something that, that he can speak to, but, is that something that we're already identifying, kind of currently, and is there a way to be able to kind of tie that back? Because my question really kind of more stems is that some of this we're already incurring, something's already, kind of, we're dealing with it. Have we already started to allocate resources, both, staff and payroll, et cetera, to do certain things that we now that ARPA's in place, that we can identify, and then almost that same kind of replenishment of what we're already doing.
I mean, I feel like we have what we used to call our CASA, the coalition, that's already in place, and that's to identify, substance abuse issues and, also even mental health issues. And
Right.
so there is something already in place. There was also that position that we had added, the mental health professional. If that person was working on things that we considered COVID related, it could be a salary that could go to the grant, or a portion of the salary could go to the grant as well as the benefits. But we have to be able to keep track and prove the time spent was spent on COVID response. But again, it's very loose because they're talking about the impact being increased mental health issues, increased substance abuse problems, increased, suicide, all kinds of negative responses and numbers that are up over years past, due to the pandemic. So I guess I just wonder how we identify, if that's what the person does, their whole salary could potentially be. It's hard to know. So we have to decide how we want to use the funding. I mean, we could even just say to ourselves, well, this person is doing outreach. That is an allowable expense for that benefit, that behavioral mental health and all of that. But we also have to consider it's not an endless pool of money. So we also have to consider, do we put all of it there? Do we do a quarter of that person's salary? Even if we know that they're very devoted on that one function, that's their job.
I mean, and I guess that this gets back, and I think it's something, Gene or someone else might have said, but it's, again, establishing, I think the only way that you're going to be able to, kind of properly measure that is by having an historical baseline as far as anything, whether it's revenue coming in or calls that are coming in, you have a kind of a line that's drawn that's historically one thing, and then whatever you're seeing today. And then, there's only a few things that, you can attribute to that, and one of them obviously being COVID. I think that might be, I mean, I don't know if that's the thought process.
As potential eligible uses, it's something that they're seeing across the country as being a major concern, is that these numbers are up dramatically and they believe they're pandemic related. So I feel like we wouldn't have a hard time justifying it. We just have to prioritize what we want to use the money on and how much we allot to each category, I guess, is what I think.
Gotcha. So, I mean, I guess oh, go ahead, Bob. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, to summarize, I agree with a lot of the most recent comments. My only take on this is that for things the town is not doing and should do, that's a different discussion than what the town has already done or is doing now. And I think it's important that the town accountant keep us all appraised of what's our flexibility to look backwards and pay for things, as well as what's our availability of paying for things that are in the budget now. To me, that's the only rush is, if there's a limit on how far back you can go, or, when you have to talk about funds being currently spent, that's an important discussion for you all to have sooner. The other things, regardless of how urgent they are something that you can discuss a little more fully. But I think you need to know what's the timeline, what's the time frame, if there is one. I'm going to guess that, for instance, no matter what the federal guidelines are, Sharon's going to have a difficult time paying for things in a prior fiscal year because it's already closed. So it would be important not to miss some kind of opportunity for other things that aren't necessarily stated in the grant.
That's a valid point. I will say that for premium pay, and I don't know if I mentioned it, we can go back to the beginning of the pandemic because we're not actually paying them. We're paying them in this year, but we could go back if we were doing hour for hour and we wanted to pay premium pay to a specific job group. We could go back to the beginning of the pandemic. I think that's March of 2020 that we would be able to kind of start to go back, and we could go forward as well with the premium pay.
So maybe just kind of maybe on that same point, or that's kind of related to, I think, the slide that you had that had all of the grants that we've been eligible for allocated to us. So, and I know that on the school side, that we're kind of halfway through It's a two.
It appeared that
$1.2 million.
the school had 2 grants in fiscal '21. They probably had different intents, so different grants for fiscal '21, and then 2 more of those same grants for fiscal '22. So where we saw half the money expended, that makes sense. We're kind of early into fiscal '22. We haven't used the money for fiscal '22.
And just for clarity, and I think I already know the answer to this, but just, to clarify, those have different stipulations associated with them versus.
They're very school-driven, yeah.
Very school-driven, but, are those more kind of, kind of associated with, kind of PPE and things of that nature? Or are there certain tenants that are kind of part of ARPA that would also kind of apply to schools using that kind of same, kind of logic?
In terms of in fiscal '22, we could be charging things to those grants or ARPA. I think there might be some interchangeable pieces, but I'm not as familiar with the school grants. We have to look at what the similarities are between eligible cost for the school grants, because I'm not the one putting the expenses through, so I'm not as familiar. So there could be some overlap there in terms of what those grants could be used for and ARPA, and then it's just our choice what funding we use if there is overlap.
Gotcha. Go ahead, Tom.
I was just gonna say that, some of the ESSER stuff
That's in that list from a CARES perspective, while it hasn't been spent yet, it has been committed. So we need to think about the difference between spent and committed. Ed, you might remember one of the meetings at the end of June where we talked about some of the hiring that we're going to get done this year, 2.5 additional team chairs, additional counselor at the high school, a tutor, that went across the elementary schools, or adjustment counselor at the elementary schools. Some of those things are already baked in. And Tom, who's in the audience, can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they've been hired. I know the team chairs have been, because I met them the other day. So while it hasn't been spent technically, it has been committed, and the people are in the roles. So that's one thing to think about. Some of that money already is committed as opposed to spent. And there are different rules for the ESSER funds in terms of what we can do and what we can't do. Definitely. But we can circle back with Susan, who's starting tomorrow, and document that fully now that Gail is rolling off.
Question.
Hey, Jackie, just one quick thing. There's someone in the waiting room to come back in.
I let him back in.
Perfect. Just want to, I didn't know. Oh, he's back in. Okay, thank you. Any other questions from anybody on this? Sharon, I think we let you go as long as we could on this one. I think you got off easy, frankly.
Yeah, I do too.
So I think at this point, Bob, you're going to take the reins and kind of talk about capital plan projects and so forth.
Thanks, Ed. I'm going to talk a little more about the financial health of the town, a longer-term financial look. I think, given your current discussion, it's quite obvious why. And I sent a long memo to all of you. I'm not going to spend nearly as much time on those details because you can just read it. But, for others that haven't seen it, I do want to just take an overview. I'll start with debt, because debt is one of the most important decisions a community makes. You have a 10-year capital plan that can be changed 2 or 3 times a year, but once you issue debt, you have to pay the debt, or so I'm told. So before we issue debt, it really requires pretty strong buy-in from the community. The discussion you just had opens up new avenues of financing, certainly, for some projects. But I think you should continue to go with a framework, as Jean suggested, that what are the important things to do? And then the second question is, well, how do we pay for them? So I don't think it's, if there's not a top 10 thing to do, just because you could spend someone else's money on it, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the wisest choice. When Sharon sits down and runs the numbers, she'll come up with probably several $100,000 a year in lost revenue, just because I'm thinking of local revenues, never mind interest rates. So that, that would potentially cover many things that we do or we want to do. So I just want to bring us back to sort of the bigger picture, longer term on finance, but start with debt, because again, that decision, once it's made, is permanent. On the screen and in your packets, the top 4 items on the left-hand column, which is debt authorization, town meeting has already approved. So no matter what else happens, we will be borrowing for these projects. 2 have been borrowed already from the MWRA. One happens to be lead removal, which is certainly coincidental. And the other 2 we would borrow from the public marketplace for the high school stadium turf and the Parker roof. Although we will not have a September town meeting, sometime this fall, there's 3 other projects, and if you've read the background, you'll see the various sort of time frames that have been discussed, have been in the capital plan. One had not had a number assigned to it. One had a number that was assigned that was too low. But I'll start and I'll go through them briefly, not right now, but after I sort of finish the summary. And those would be the list of near-term capital. I don't think there's any other capital projects. Much is being discussed, but nothing else is what I would call shovel-ready, that it's been through some sort of public process, including tonight, that it's planned up and out enough and costed out enough so that we can move forward. I had another meeting today on what I'll call Streetscape 2. We've identified $7-odd million of improvements. I'm sure the number could grow if it wanted to. And again, none of these projects are, I would say, immediate. Over here, just mostly for FinCom's knowledge, this is how we issue debt. So we generally try to group things together. So the Parker roof and the stadium turf would be issued at some point in the next several months. If there are other things that town meeting approves, we would add on to that. And somewhat on purpose, there's a gap here of a couple of years or a year and a half where we probably don't have to issue debt. And obviously all of this can change with the federal monies. It can change any of our plans. But I just wanted to begin with, this is how we look at longer term finance in the town. And this is just a picture I don't usually show you, but it's just an element of the longer term financial plan. The second point was that if you saw the capital plan and read the discussion, as Ed has already mentioned, FinCom did ask about a year ago or so to increase our capital spending, partly because interest rates were low when we borrow. And certainly the financial picture of the town has improved since FinCom said that, and this addition of other monies would also seem to support that approach if it's necessary or desired. Capital spending as opposed to debt spending, which is just a way to finance the capital, is much more flexible. You can tell the fire chief he's going to get a new ladder truck, but then you can change your mind at the last minute, not using that as a specific example, because that's already approved. But the point is, when things change, you can always change a capital plan until the item is approved and purchased. Right now, as you can see, the capital plan, the capital spending that I put in front of FinCom is just under 5.5% for the next 3 years, a little bit lower than that in the 4th year, and then back to 5%, which is FinCom's current policy after 4 years. Obviously, that number is your choice and ultimately town meeting's choice, but just to show you an updated plan, that's what we showed. Just to give a real quick snapshot of the October Financial Forum with, still certainly much uncertainty. It looks like we should have 3.25%, maybe 3.5% for the operating budgets for the school and the town. That's based on a lot of assumptions, which, FinCom may or may not agree with, including the free cash assumption. But at this point in time, for a budget process that doesn't begin really for another month or two, this is pretty good. This is a pretty good picture. Certainly better than it had been in the most recent 3 years. And honestly, it's probably one of the better pictures since we've had the override in terms of that. But again, there are assumptions. There's an assumption that I listed out in terms of what free cash you're willing to spend, which is higher than you'd normally spend. Free cash won't be certified for quite some time, but I know both the school and the town turned back spending we could not execute last year. So the free cash, number really should grow. And we didn't end up having a revenue deficit, which was also a plus. So I thought it was important for you to understand kind of the operating picture short term before you started engaging on longer term discussions, even though it's not certain. At this point, I can go into as much or as little detail on specific capital projects. When they do go to a town meeting, obviously, there needs to be a full discussion, and I assumed we may as well start that tonight if there's no objection. The first one, in no particular order, is energy improvements for town buildings, for public buildings. I gave some background in the packet, especially for folks that weren't around 12 years ago when we did the first phase. We have worked with Noresco since that point. They've been a good partner. Even better, they've guaranteed us certain savings and would pay us cash if the savings didn't materialize. That's what performance contracting is, and they did their work, and they followed up, making sure we do our preventative maintenance, and they have not needed to write us a check yet. So we have saved significant amounts of both energy and money since then. It's been over 10 years now. We had planned to revisit this in a couple of years when the 15-year debt was paid. The opportunity, once again, to join Green Communities made us look at it faster. So we just did it maybe 2 years faster than we might have. If you go to the meeting that's scheduled in September, and I'll send you all a reminder on Green Communities, led by the Climate Advisory Committee. Noresco is attending. They will make a much more detailed presentation than I will tonight. Suffice to say that every possible improvement made in a public building was looked at. Some were chosen, many were discarded. Well, many on a dollar price were discarded. One was very large and not very efficient. I gave FINCOM a little more detail than you received at your last meeting when you asked some questions to try to peek into that a little bit more. But the summary level of this project is that there's a similar to 12 years ago, there's another $5 million of improvements that will generate over a 15% savings in energy, which is good for many reasons, one of them being financial. But it's also a key need to join communities. It's a requirement. You have to demonstrate how you can realistically save 20% of energy based on whatever the baseline is, which I think was chosen to be a year before the pandemic. In order to save 20%, some communities that's pretty easy if they've never really done any maintenance or done any work. It's not hard. For us, it was more difficult because of the work we did many years ago, which wasn't eligible to be counted. We can hit this number of just almost 16% with the project as proposed, and the remaining 4% does not have to be immediate, and it does not have to be 100% scientific. It has to be a plan. It has to be a plan which Noresco has worked out and MAPC has approved, or believe it will be approved, so that this would be an important step for green communities. And the reason that this project is a little more urgent is really because Noresco has guaranteed the prices through December. As much as they can, they've also guaranteed the sourcing of materials, which is getting to be a little more challenging. And both those facts, especially the price, make it, as soon as this can be approved, if it's what the community wants, then we should try that. If this waits till November town meeting, I think it's still possible that we hit the guarantee, but it's much, much tighter. Town meeting has to finish, presuming there's no, I think there will be one bylaw in town meeting in November, which requires AG approval. Town council believes we can segregate this piece out away from that in order to not have to wait. So it is possible that November town meeting can accomplish this, but certainly if we were going to have another town meeting in the fall, this would presumably be on it. I'll stop there rather than going into details and just ask, is there any questions that should be answered tonight on this project? Yeah, Karen.
A quick question. This commitment to green communities, it's a 20% savings over 5 years, and the technology is changing really fast and the world changes. So is Noresco, does this, our agreement with them and the way we work with them, is we have the flexibility to say, hey, we came up with this plan today. Like, are we spending $5 million immediately and this is what we're going to live with? Or is this something that is phased in? And I'm going to repeat myself. So it didn't all have to be done like by December. So is it flexible?
It's not flexible. The work does not have to be done by December, but the exact plan that's approved does have to be done. And if the past is any example, it was done within a year. So it's work that's done quickly so that the energy savings can happen quickly. If you want to do other measures and other things, you always have the flexibility to do that. The technology will not change fast enough within that year, but it could change within 5 years. For instance, to replace the lights, whether it's buildings or whether it's street lights or traffic lights, the technology was improving almost every 2 or 3 years. But at some point, just like the decision to buy your own computer, when it keeps getting cheaper, you have to just do it. So this does not offer the flexibility you mentioned. But if you saw in the packet from FinCom's discussion at their last meeting, there was a second piece to this that I wanted to put together, but it really makes sense to separate it out, which is what other improvements can you make either in buildings or in the community that can be done exactly as the way you just described. Can be done whenever the town wants to. It can adapt to changing technology. It can be a community conversation. This is much more a finite package for all the buildings. And if, for instance, the community or FinCom or town meeting doesn't want to spend $5 million, it is scalable, so it can be smaller. And that's what there's some of that detail in your packet, but there'll be more presented at the Climate Advisory Committee's forum.
Okay, and I was thinking about a phasing approach as well. I was wondering about the timeline. Like you're asking for $5 million now, it has to all be put in place within a year, and that's the only kind of plan that's acceptable?
That's right, yep.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah, the rest of the savings can be on that plan, but for performance contracting, it's understood to be done, I think, within 18 months.
Okay, thanks.
Quick.
Thanks, Ed. So Bob, is this the $5 million in order to qualify us into green communities or next level kind of thing? Because I know you mentioned in there that the RMLD hurdle still exists. So is this, we would do the $5 million and then it's still just this RMLD issue? Or how does it correlate to that?
Yeah, you'll hear more at this meeting, but there still is the issue with RMLD that we encountered over a decade ago. There's been different legislative remedies proposed and possible, but this alone will not allow the town to join green communities. But without this, the town will not be able to join green communities.
So it kind of hinges on...
It's still an investment in savings, so.
Yeah. I just know from dealing with computer-related stuff, I just know every single year, obviously something more energy efficient and better just comes out the following year. My own personal thing, I was getting an electric F-150, and then in researching, like waiting for it to come out in April, they're already talking about version 2 in 2025. And I'm like, well, I wonder how much better this one's going to be. And now it's like twice the range. So I wouldn't want to see us fall into, spending $5 million when 2 years from now, like $5 million gets us twice as what we could, as an example.
I'm struggling, and you anticipated this in the memo, I'm struggling a little bit with the payback on some of these items. Can you talk a little bit, and I understand broadly that you looked at, well, we have to replace these at some point soon. Can you, I don't even know how you put numbers to this, so maybe more color commentary.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about things like the boilers? We need to replace them soon anyway, so we'll do them in this way. How much sooner do they really need to be replaced, and how much more, if any amount at all, are we paying for the energy efficiency? I'm trying to kind of get comfortable with the, I think you're talking 10 years of debt for the $5 million?
Probably 15.
So 10
actually.
or 15 years of debt, and yet no benefit till 20. I just would like to get a little comfortable with it. I think, so could you talk a little bit about the thinking on that?
Sure. The boilers, as the best example, are things that are not necessary because of green communities or performance contracting. They're just things the town had on the plan to do and should do. In terms of when, I don't remember which, honestly, but one of them was already last year, and one was within 2 years after that. We generally try to be a little more proactive with our boiler and other replacements that are pretty significant if they don't work. Having a boiler fail in the winter is a horrible situation. Some of our buildings can stand that because there's multiple boilers. Some cannot. So, that's the risk of not doing new boilers when you have to, is you might get lucky and it might be fine. And what happens when it isn't? What's your backup plan to, have kids go to a different school or, whatever else the loss is? So that, as you can see from the table I put up here, and it's in your packet, it's a horrible payback. It doesn't fit this model at all.
Right.
And honestly, if you took it out, you'd see what the real project is from a performance contracting energy efficiency standpoint. And that's easy enough to do that math. We did the same approach the first time, although not to this magnitude, where we put some things in there that were things that the town needed to do in some relatively short amount of time, did not have a great payback, but were cheaper to do if they were rolled into this package. And at the time, it didn't matter quite so much, but now the extra benefit slightly is the savings do count for this green communities, where if we do it outside of this, they will not. So that's the best way I can summarize it. If this does not move forward and stops immediately, we would be requesting the $2 million either with funds that fell out of the sky or things that can be afforded within the next year or two. They're that important.
Just one quick follow-up.
No, not allowed.
Just diving right in. In terms of the boilers particularly, because they're the biggest ticket item on here, is there any additional cost for the boilers because they're green or energy efficient? Or is this basically what you'd pay to replace the boilers anyway?
Same boiler, yep.
That's helpful.
And it's really hard to answer your kind of implied question is, what's the cost doing it inside this and outside this?
Yeah.
Because the markets are all in such a disarray, I don't know the answer.
Well, but there's also an implied thing here, is that if you put them off, there's also probably maintenance.
Yeah.
And everything else that needs to be happening in the interim as well.
Yeah.
Especially if they're that close, there's a lot of duct tape that you're going to be able, that you're buying to keep them afloat. I think that's implied in there too, isn't there, Bob?
It is, yes. So those boilers especially should not be viewed in the same lens at all. They just happen to be part of Noresco's work.
And in a way, it helps get you to the.
But that's what I was just going to say the same thing. I was just going to say the same thing. It's a little bit convenient in that you can take something and pull it in.
Yep.
Yeah, and the payback with the remaining work is, I just eyeballed it quickly. It's either 10 or just under 10 years. So,
and I think that's a very important point.
That's helpful.
Because Gene, and I'm sure others kind of share the same thing, is what that payback is. But if you take out the end of the barbell where it's really terrible, and really but you're doing that for a different reason. You're not doing the boilers for the payback. You're doing the boilers because you can.
And you're going to do them one
And
way
you're going to do
or
them
another.
anyways.
Yeah.
Then, if the payback is really important, do what Bob says, take out the 208, and then look at the number, and it goes from 20 to 10 or something
yeah,
closer.
and let me step back 12 years to give you a little more color, which would be helpful in how to think about this. Before Reading came along, performance contracting was done almost 100% of the time, not by selling debt. It was essentially a leaseback agreement with the vendor. So for instance, not our school committee, but a school committee could go ahead and do this on their buildings without any other authority or any other approval. They have the authority to approve a contract, a lease contract like that. Reading, in working closely with the schools back then, looked at the implied interest rate on lease arrangements and said, we can do better. If we are willing to take the public process, which a lot of people weren't, then we can, finance this more effectively. So if we were not borrowing and we were doing the other arrangement, I would never do the boilers that way. It's just way too expensive and not worth it. Because the theory being, you're taking on implied debt, but you don't see it because it's all wrapped into the cost is wrapped into the savings. And the vendor receives the energy savings for a period of time until they're satisfied. So you don't get any energy savings financially for, let's say, 15 years. They do, instead of debt service.
Yeah.
And it was just more beneficial for Reading with a good credit rating to just borrow. But the thing we were willing to do that few others did then and now a little more are is really talk to everyone and say, we want to be transparent. We think this is a good idea. So, your thinking in terms of the inefficiency of the boilers would have been much more accurate under that old model where you needed to get the payback in order to do the deal.
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Agreed. Anybody else? Any questions? Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, Ed. So just to clarify, the new boilers, the return on investment, I really can't see it, but I believe it was over 250 years, which nobody would ever agree would be practical. But we need these regardless of the scenario. So it's kind of skewing the 40-year return on investment. So to me, like if you say, Chris, we need $3 million on boilers, you'll get paid back 250 years. I'll be like, you're out of your mind. But we don't have an alternative. So to me, that's something that would make financial sense. So, and it does throw the number off significantly. So.
Yeah, and you can see from the first list of possible improvements, the 13 million, we did take out, it was either 1 or 2 boilers that were just not as critical. And then the payback, slightly improved from 300 years to 200 years, if you want to call that improvement. And then the cost was reduced. And those other boilers will be done in the capital plan at some point in the next 10 years or 15 years.
Isn't there also too, Bob, like, and again, I don't know if this is in the estimated savings or not, but in your, like, again, if you were looking at the boilers in and of themselves as far as like your payback, and again, you probably don't look at it in years, maybe you do, but isn't it also that savings, not necessarily from an efficiency perspective, but you're also looking at it from a maintenance perspective as well?
Yeah, if we were looking at this outside this project, we would never look at the energy savings. I mean, we know that modern equipment tends to be more efficient than old equipment, and we'd look at it. But it's, from a financial standpoint and from a risk standpoint, you'd be looking at what's the operating cost to keep this thing going, and what's the odds that we can't.
Yep. I think that's an important point. Again, this table is obviously very helpful, but I think it gives you an imperfect lens into all of the costs that you're addressing, with it.
That's right.
Any other questions? Am I missing anybody? No one online? Okay.
I actually had one, but it's going
my
back.
Gosh.
I know. Apologies. He's going to start limiting me. Bob, would you mind going back up to what you first described, which is the debt authorization and debt issuance tables when you were doing the overview? This is actually just a clarifying question. I just want to make sure that your assumptions for the subsequent years would still be a little bit above the 5%, but then you get to 5% around FY27. You are including things like energy improvement 2 and streetscape 2 and the water meters and whatnot. All those assumptions are in there.
That's correct.
Okay, so it's not just using these. So presumably if those numbers come in higher, you readjust, right?
Right.
You do what we do, which is that's more than we thought, so what don't we do? Okay.
Right.
All right.
And to the extent that, shortly we'll have discussions, and you'll continue to have discussions for a long time about things not on the list, that would be additional possible debt or capital, that you could add on that's not in the capital plan right now. So just as an example of something that's come up, and this, if you recall, and I know FINCOM will, your discussion about the 2 turf fields, the third priority at the time was the high school, floor,
The
gym floor.
Yep.
And that's not in the plan formally with a funding number or date, but that's an example of something that, if it becomes important or urgent, can easily be added. And you saw the list of all the Birch Meadow and other recreation and athletic improvements. The ones in the section that were specifically new and listed are not in the capital plan with a number. They're things the community has to discuss and decide. What do we want to do, what do we not want to do, and then how do we pay for it? So everything on this list is assumed.
Yeah, I mean, and when we went back and we talked about, just, again, for other folks, just a reminder, when we went back and most recently talked about the stadium turf and track, one of the things that really, kind of came to light and, again, financial pieces aside, was the safety issue.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I think that's, again, there's, to every, a lot of times these are just numbers on a page. As far as how you kind of play around with them, and I mean that loosely, but like, they end up being, kind of numbers on a page, but they end up getting moved and prioritized based on other important factors, whether it's maintenance costs or, kind of shelf life, but then also, as it relates to this, it's the safety of for the, stadium turf and the track for multiple uses, not just the, the students, but there's obviously other folks that use it. Same thing with the school gymnasium. I think that's, something that we should be, kind of mindful of, from that perspective, is if we're closer to that, then, then we might know, then that might be something we need to look at.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah, that's really, if you will, the same discussion as the boilers. It's a risk discussion.
Yeah.
It's not an efficiency or a financial discussion only. No other questions. We'll move on to just two more projects that are, potentially near term. The first is $1.5 million to the police station, done in two parts. The first, which I explained, is, and they're about half and half in cost. The first is to take what's an unused space, which the police department has recently cleaned out very nicely, and turn it into a training room / conference room. The building is in somewhat of a disarray. Luckily, the police officers are fine, as I understand it. The actual conference room has been taken out of action for a couple of years, right around when the pandemic started. It had been used for some town board meetings. It had been used for some public meetings, some groups. It is in a public section of the building. You don't need to pass through anything secure, and that wouldn't really be allowed for a lot of the public groups anyways. Since that room has been taken down, obviously there's a lot less public meetings, but there's also been no call for it to be put back, which is interesting. And we know there is a meeting space shortage generally, but fortunately this building has taken a lot of that slack, if you will. The security study looked at that as a conference room and suggested that was not ideal. If it was going to continue to be an emergency operations center, there should be clear improvements made. The windows were very vulnerable, for instance. And I'm not speaking so much for, human terrorist kind of risk as weather. If we're meeting to discuss a hurricane and we're in a room where there's lots of windows and the hurricane blows them in, well, that wasn't really the smartest room to meet in. The expansion space makes for a far better emergency operations center. It's in a much safer portion of the building. It's nearer some of the, technology for what that's worth. But I think more importantly, starting a year ago, it's also a place to offer training for the current police force as well as potentially some others for all the police reform that's come along. And, given it's come along at a time during the pandemic, virtually all of it is offered online. They are not meeting in person to give this type of seminars. And, that may or may not change in the next year. So the expansion room turned into a combination of conference room and potential emergency operations center is a really good use of that space. We had kicked around many, many possibilities, and that really did rise to the top from many people's perspective as being a good use. That work can't begin until sometime later this fall, early this winter. From a timing standpoint, this one is not as urgent to be done in a town meeting before November. It would be slightly helpful. The current work on dispatch is the cutover date, the 15th.
September 15th, yeah.
So on the 15th, the new dispatch center will have the dispatchers move back into it on or about. 9/11 service will continue, but I think they're going to go to Wakefield for a short period of time in order to offer the 911 service. The dispatchers have been great in terms of being relocated across the hall into very suboptimal spaces where they could still do their jobs, but it wasn't very comfortable. They'll have real good technology when they move back. Once that work is done in September and a little bit more work is done on the space they had to temporarily occupy, the building would then be ready for further renovation. Combination of this project and some of the security work has really disrupted the building for quite some time, and from many standpoints, it'd be good to get this work done sooner than later. Part two of the improvements would be once all of that is done, and the functions I mentioned can be housed appropriately, then the old conference room, just to the right as you walk in to the police station, can be made into offices for public health as well as the coalition and the mental health position. I think it's ideal that all those functions sit together. A future discussion can happen at some point as to should they be combined under one department. I will tell you, I had that discussion about almost 10 years ago and was told point blank for the reasons that was a stupid idea, and it was. And that's because the current coalition is part of a tri-party agreement with the district attorney's office, and they're covered under the police department and they can have access to information. If they were a standalone department, or at that point part of a public health department, they could not. So there was a real solid reason. Any other reason I came up with is not as good as they would lose their ability to do their jobs. So whether that can be, changed in the future, whether the DA would take a new look at public health, for instance, I don't know. But we don't really need to change an org chart to make it easier for people that should work together to be able to work together. And that's really what this goal is. My only real concern with this is how large will this operation become someday? Will the town need several mental health professionals, several substance abuse professionals? There's just really no way to know, though. If it becomes so large as to outgrow this space, then it's also going to outgrow the police department, and it will have to have a future discussion. So I'm not really concerned about that. I do note that, over a 10-year period, you might be growing the staff to a level where that becomes tight. But that's kind of a good problem to have in a way. If you can afford to do that and you need it, then you work on that and you figure it out. Our coalition director and her various number 2 people have worked in what I will call very cramped and suboptimal conditions for many years, sharing what should be a one-person office sometimes with 2 and more. So, and having no privacy for guests. That's a complaint and a comment I got from some of our public health professionals and board members over the last few years especially, is Town Hall did not offer any privacy for staff to have a discussion that needs privacy. So what we would do is kind of informally reserve one of the conference rooms to be used at a drop of a hat. And it worked most of the time pretty well. By the same token, a couple of HR directors ago, she had the same issue. She had to meet people out in the common on benches. That was privacy. Town Hall was not built to have privacy. It was not built to be a town hall, honestly. Anyone trying to come in and use the restroom understands right away that it's not on the main floor. You have to go find it. So that's another discussion for another day, but privacy for public health is also really important, and this would offer that. And I think, again, pretty much all of our groups, divisions, departments work together really well, including the functions I've mentioned. But again, the mental health position is new, and to put it into a space where it's very clear who should be working together can only be helpful. So that's really it in a nutshell for the police station work. I know there was a comment about I may have reconsidered my vote if I had known the cost. Well, truly, the cost of the health department does not need to do this. It can stand alone as it is on paper and would just make do a town hall. So that's not a gating item. This is just to make it, I think, much better and prepare us better for the future. If we do want health to move into the police station, some work has to be done somewhere. Could we leave the conference room where it is and move them to the expansion space? Well, technically, yes. And you're going to spend at least as much money to do the expansion room. But then you're going to have the problem of the public does not have access to that space. And a police officer would have to escort anyone that would want to come in. And one of the reasons I wanted to have the then Arcasa have a presence at Town Hall is, respectfully, not everyone wants to go in a police department for whatever their issues are. They want to have a lot more privacy. And I think coming in and taking a quick ride in a police station is a lot less intimidating than being escorted by a police officer somewhere to where you ultimately would want to go. So this seems to be a better long-term solution, and it does cost money. It is. We had anticipated using facilities funds for half of this at the end of the year. It didn't happen fast enough, so the mean town accountant wouldn't let us do that and keep the money. And facilities did some other work and then turned a boatload back to free cash, which you'll see next month. So I'll stop there and ask if there's any questions on the police station, and the chief is here. Both chiefs are here if you have questions.
Not from my end, Bob. I again, in the last two meetings, I so appreciate you going through the detail as far as, and the thought process, and kind of, and again, I'm a history buff, knowing kind of that, how you've looked to address it at one point in time, and how the facts change, and they change to make these, these details, I think, has been really helpful. I've kind of come to learn a lot and appreciate the thought process behind it. Anybody else have any questions? I don't see anybody online. Yeah, no one in the room. I think
Either chief want to make any comments? If you do, you have to go up to the podium, though. And if one chief wants to contradict the other, that's okay.
So Greg just agreed to give me half his budget. No. I would just like to, one thing Bob pointed out is mostly for security. We have a great working relationship with the coalition. It's been fantastic having them in the building. We have a domestic violence advocate in the building to respond. That's been great. But again, it can be intimidating to people coming in and getting escorted. So having the office space just outside the lobby where the public can come and go freely, but also provides a level of security for public health and the mental health clinician and the coalition. So 24-hour access, if they need to come in outside of hours on a Saturday, on an evening, something's going on, they're still secure. They're not alone over in Town Hall. They'd be in with the building where it's still secure, but the public can freely come and go. And we think that's part of it. And we had some big incidents throughout the couple of years where we learned that that community room wasn't an optimal emergency operations center, where every time we opened up the door, the press was outside in the lobby, a public space, trying to get a statement from us. So every time we stepped out to do something, dispatch, use the restroom, anything, we were getting bombarded. Moving it upstairs makes it secure, makes it a better place for us to function, and during emergency have proper space that we need. And also, the fire chief, I will speak for him this one time, we are totally supportive of public health coming over and working together, and I agree with Bob 100%. There's a fantastic idea, thinking outside the box, where all these groups are going to have to work together. Putting them in one central location helps that and achieves that to a maximum level. And where they're housed, it's not going to affect anything. They happen to be housed at the police station because we have the space. It's not going to affect their relationship. It's going to actually make it stronger and work together and help us service the community better if we can all be together in that one location. That's what I'll say. Thank you.
Thanks, Chief.
Now, if there's nothing else, we'll move on to the elephant in the room, which is the water tank. I was appalled to need to ask for $1.5 million, and then we got the bids open late on, I think it was Thursday, and saw that I shouldn't have been so appalled because it's going to be much more expensive than that. So I'll go over this project, but I'll start by saying I have no idea what the right business plan and solution is at this point. We have some work in progress in terms of the carriers getting off the equipment and coming up with a temporary tower. We're going to have to talk to town council in terms of, do we have flexibility to wait? For instance, I just want to know what all our options are, and I want to know, is that an option? And I'm not saying it's the best option. I'm just saying I need to know what the options are, and it's just too soon to know that. So I'll kind of have a quick discussion and just assume we're going to go forward and ask for $2.5 million extra. It could be a little less, but that's close enough to complete this work. I don't know how much more information and detail you need. I have not seen a breakdown, but I will see a breakdown on the extra million, and it's almost all timing and price of steel related. And I honestly thought we put in a pretty good number for that. And the real problem behind it is there's only one vendor that's willing to take this on, and they did it for a price. So if you had a much more competitive market, I'd feel a lot better. I hate doing things when there's no competition. It's just not a good business practice. So we really have to study kind of what our options are. The driving force behind replacing the water tank was kind of twofold. One is, once upon a time, with a prior cost-benefit analysis, painting the tank every 15 years was far more expensive than replacing it. I'm not sure of those numbers, what they'd look like today. I also know it'd be hard to find someone to paint it. The other issue was, at some point, the DEP, and I think it's more Mass DEP, is going to issue us a consent decree because the standards of the water tank would not be deemed safe. And, I think we would probably shout long before they would in terms of what's safe and not, but just to be clear, it's not necessarily our call. At some point, the tank would have to be replaced. It is past its useful life, where it should have been improved. It should have been repainted on the inside, for instance. And Reading is fortunate that we do have another water tank in town. Some towns don't have any. We have 2. So, taking this tank offline for whatever the improvements, that are ultimately decided is okay. It doesn't cripple our water system. We still have redundancy. We still have backup fire supply. We do now have 2 connections to the MWRA water, both from the south. Until when we only had 1, we were always waiting to really do any work because that's risk. Now that there's 2, they believe they have good redundancy. If if an 18-wheeler takes out one of the bridges and takes out one of the entrances to town, they shift to the other. So that was, a great improvement. So we're much less at risk in losing water, unless the whole system loses water like they did several years ago. But having another tank is just an additional security that if we do have an extensive fire, we don't have to rely fully on MWRA water pressure. We can use the tank. So from a safety standpoint, even without this tank in service, I think we're okay for a period of time, certainly. So I'll want to, I have not talked to the engineers since they got the bids and opened them. I'll need to do that. There was a reason to do this sooner than later, and that was before prices went up. I'd say that reason probably has just run out the barn door. I don't know anymore. I don't know what to recommend to you or to town meeting where this should sit, whether we should do it in October, do it in November, or just say, let's do it another year or 2. I just don't know. I would feel a lot better if I knew the suppliers were going to be more competitive, not just the price of steel. This is just it's become a very specialized industry where there's just not a lot of options. Some of that was caused by the pandemic. Some of it was true before the pandemic started. So before the select board in particular needs to call for a special town meeting, I'll have to have more answers than I have tonight. There's a possibility that a special town meeting would be helpful in October, and this might not be on it, just as an example. And this was initially the driving force in having a special town meeting. But if there are other items that can't wait to November, and I indicated one in a memo, then this item may just get kicked down the road. The other issue is, I'd probably suggest this warrant article be listed on every town meeting for the foreseeable future, because then you can do it.
Yep.
And if you don't, you don't. You saw from the FINCOM schedule earlier, the board might be closing 2 warrants on the same night. And honestly, my recommendation is put this article on both, and then we talk about it and we see, do we do it in October, do we do it in November, do we not do it at all?
Yep.
So that's really all I have now. Will prices go up another $2 million in another year?
Since, and just maybe a question, and maybe you know this, or maybe not, but do you have any other kind of anecdotal evidence of other towns, or whether it's within Mass or in the region, is everyone kind of been held at the same knife point, or is it or is there just so few of them going on that's in and of itself kind of lends itself to this?
Yeah, there is few. If you'd asked me 2.5 years ago, I would have said, here's the examples that are current. I seriously doubt that anyone is replacing a water tank right now unless they have no choice because the DEP has told them to. It's not the right market to do it. Why would you hurry? We just happen to have a process that started several years ago, and we are where we are. And the real question is, what are our options?
Yep.
What are the costs of those options? And then, I always like to ask myself, when you're in a situation like this, well, would I start this now? And I'm leaning towards a no, but I don't want to say that definitively. So, it's definitely a discussion, and probably a pretty full discussion. First, it'll happen with staff. What does staff think? They understand the risks better than I do, and that's, as we've discussed tonight, that's an important backdrop, not just the money.
Right.
Is part of that information gathering process, could it include maybe more detail on the likelihood and magnitude of a DEP kind of consequence?
Yes, and one other factor that I didn't mention that I know has been discussed is the select board decided to separate this project from other improvements that go on in the neighborhood. But if this project is not on the front burner anymore, then in theory, that discussion could expand in terms of, parks or whatever else.
Open space kind of thing. Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, we can definitely flesh out the DEP risk a little bit better. And, it ties into things like we still are operating well fields from the old water treatment plant, which is at least loosely related. Same, there's a consent decree on that. So we'll try to get a fuller picture on all those pieces and how they work together.
Yeah, I just really like the idea of having it on multiple warrants moving forward. I don't think that's a bad idea at all. Partly as a transparency, so we don't forget about it.
Yeah.
And I would update the capital plan with the new horrible number. It's same thing, like until we decide not to do it or to use something else, this is what we're looking at. So I think that's a good approach.
Yeah, and
or,
just
until it gets revised, and then if it gets, revised and new information comes out, good, bad, or indifferent, then you have that there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to remind everyone, respectfully, this is not subject to Prop 2.5. This is just how much money are you willing to spend. It's going to be on the water ratepayers. We have multiple possible sources of funding. We have different ways to finance it. But it is not in any sense something you can't do unless you don't do something else. It's really a choice that stands on its own, which at least is nice from that standpoint, that it's just kind of an up, down, yes, no decision. And honestly, we do have enough water reserves. We could pay this. Reserves last I knew were around 6 million. Does that sound right for water? I can't remember, but a typical year, reserves are between $500,000 and $1 million to support the budget. You could easily add another $1 million and just, if you will, pay cash for this without stressing the whole system. So we're in a good position. It's annoying, but we're in a good financial position to move forward and take any option we think is right.
I think that's the other part of it too. I think that's helpful too, is knowing a little bit of that nuance, because when I saw the memo and I bristled like, how far can we punt this? From that perspective, it feels like a bad timing situation, and we're a victim of circumstance, timing and so forth, and then is there waste? Is there how feasible it is to wait? But having that other color, washes over that a little bit too.
Yeah, and just to give you more color than you've had, which may or not be helpful, several years ago when North Reading was considering joining the MWA, we were meeting with the MWA a lot to try to help. And I had a discussion with the executive director. They need storage. We have 2 tanks. I said, are you interested in 2 tanks? He said, maybe. So just to open your minds, there's no reason that Reading has to own a tank. It's a good thing, and it's definitely redundancy and safety, and I'm saying all that, but there are communities our size that don't have this. So this is a benefit, but it's also a cost, and it should be just thought of. It's not, you shouldn't automatically say, well, we have to have 2 water tanks, because that's not true. Now, I don't think the MWA is particularly interested in buying this location compared to the Bear Hill one, which is a discussion for another day, certainly. But just so you're aware, having water storage, is really important from a risk standpoint, but it's not essential. And don't get mad at me, Greg. You'll still put out the fires, but it is an option. Just because Reading's always done it this way, it doesn't have to do it this way, I guess is what I'm saying.
Okay.
Time for
But Chris, while Chuck's running, we'll let Chris talk.
He beat me. I'll let him know.
So, Bob, you may have hit this when I stepped out of the room, so, and I didn't read the memo, I apologize.
It's really good, Chuck. You should read it.
There was a picture.
In terms of, so, I mean, I think the MWRA would think that we're practicing good risk management.
yeah.
Are there any low-interest loans or any type of grants that they will help participate in this?
Yeah, they definitely have that, and we've used it to the extent we can. I've never seen one for this, and we've asked.
Well, we should ask again.
Yeah. I mean, when North Reading was on the table, I made it pretty clear to Fred Lasky, the director, that if they were going to let North Reading into their system on much more favorable terms than Reading was allowed in, we wouldn't be letting the water go through Reading without some kind of reparations, if you will. So they're a public body like anyone else. They can't just do whatever they want. But there's always a question, and if it ever got to the DEP point, I hate to say it, but we probably have a lot more access to federal and state funds.
Yeah.
If we let things fall into disrepair, that's when people sort of help you out. So, you saw earlier tonight there was two MWRA $1.5 million things. One's de-leading that is each no interest. So yeah, they do have money, and we tend to max out and use it as fast as we can. I'll have them ask again, because the MWRA, like everyone else, is getting new federal money that they had never anticipated, so you don't know.
Right.
That's a good question.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ed. So I guess no matter what, we're going to need something up there regardless because of the cell phone reception and all of that stuff. So we can't just get rid of the water tower because then something else is going to have to go up in its place anyway to service that area up there in terms of that. And then my other thought is how we had mentioned earlier about using some of the 7 million, the COVID funds, on something like this. If all of a sudden we could use $1.5 million for the water tank, all of a sudden it becomes an easier pill to swallow that now we're not, we're back to where we were originally being, like kind of screwed by having to pay the 5-6 million or whatever, but now, at least we're back to even in that regard. So possibly if we're able to spend some of that money on that, it'll shake out a little better.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing just to kind of, my thought on that one point is that now after going through that discussion, now there's an opportunity cost, for what, now if you take that and you do that, now you're taking it away from other things that, whatever that might be, so that's, now you're back into kind of figuring out how to prioritize that. I mean, I definitely see the point. It's, but my thought on that is now every one of those has a ripple, once you do that. And versus, and maybe this is, kind of for that subcommittee to be able to decide, it's like, how much do you cherish, that federal money versus, the points that Bob mentioned, that there's other options there. You know what I mean? And so it's, there's a lot of, kind of varying prioritizations that you can make with that, and and how you weigh it. So, but I definitely see your point, Chris. It's you're kind of in a little bit of an embarrassment of riches because you have kind of different options. It's which one do you weigh more?
Yeah.
Or one might not even be an option to begin with. They might not let us do it anyways.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
I'll go real quickly past some other projects, I guess I'll call them, where FINCOM's not voting on articles tonight. It's probably not as urgent. I don't see any of this changing for whenever the town meeting is, but one never knows. In terms of the projects, the window safety film, it's pretty much self-explanatory. The building security project, was done in a much different way than we expected with a different schedule. The schools were empty, at times we hadn't anticipated. So, in terms of the project, it was tremendously executed and on budget. And we were able to get all the work done we needed to and anticipated. This was, I think it was an adult, don't quote me, I know we discussed it as that, but in any event, it was outside the budget by the time the work was complete. And I guess I'll say this is a nice to have. It's hard to talk about security in public, but you know, window safety film around entrances. If you think of this building, for instance, if that was outside, you'd want window safety film on these doors, on those doors, and particularly on schools. It just makes the entrance for someone that wants to get in that you don't want in much harder to do. It's pretty self-explanatory. And you know, for a, I think it's 100,000. $140,000. And I think that might also anticipate one of the public town buildings. Pretty smaller number and less important perhaps, but we were able to partner with Mass GIS and a bunch of other communities a couple of years back, which we'd been trying to do for 15 years. And it finally worked so that we all didn't have to fly our own filming. We had to hire a plane, have them do it, do all the work later. And it was foolish because one plane can do a lot more work than just going and flying over Reading. So fortunately, the state was willing to partner and lead this. And just in the last year or so, probably because of the pandemic and funds available, they just moved it up a year. So we're just asking to move this project up 1 year. The cost shouldn't change as far as we know. Lowell Street, I gave you a detailed attachment, which I won't go over, but an estimate to repave Lowell Street from the square to the west is about $900,000, maybe a little less. We had $400,000 in the capital plan, knowing that wouldn't pay for it all, but knowing that would take a significant chunk out of it. And we just want to kick that up another $100,000 to $500,000, and that would let the work between Salem Street and Pond Street be done as the highest priority. The town does have about $1.2 million annually in road money, half from the state, half from our local taxpayers. To do a $900,000 repair with $1.2 million just means no other work's going to get done that year practically, so that wouldn't be good. But we think by taking this approach and doing half the road, or the first half of the road that's most important first, the rest of the road can be done as funds are allowed and as funds can be available from that $1.2 million. Stroud Ave is another thing that we had been discussing for quite some time. I included some history in here for you to review. My predecessor had suggested that once the water treatment plant would come down, that as part of that concept, that we'd put in some kind of a sports park, baseball park probably. And you know, worked with engineering, used all in-house resources as far as I know, and came up with a new plan, which again I included, which had quite a bit of parking. Not a lot of tree dislocation somehow. I don't know how the cars all managed to park in between trees, but they sort of did. But when conservation saw what was planned, you know, they weren't real happy to just have cars driving over effectively, you know, wetlands, I'll say. That's one of the reasons that the new water treatment plant was never built, was conservation concerns, and they had similar concerns on what the reuse would be. So the proposal from staff currently, from last winter forward, is not to do anything that conservation used to object to, but to make sure they're invited to the table, to make sure they agree that there's nothing currently proposed that they object to. And if you're familiar with the area, this is a simple discussion, but if you're not, if you exit the compost center, hoping you know where that is, and take a right, you'd find a locked gate right now. Behind that lock gate, pedestrians and dogs can freely walk past that at all times, but cars cannot. That was our old water treatment plant back there. And there is still some equipment and some well fields being maintained by our staff. We did enough work with Mass DEP to know that what we're proposing is not a risk. They are not concerned about it from a water supply source. We still use the river as an emergency source. That was much more important when the MWA only had a single connection into Reading that was vulnerable potentially. Now that there's two, we don't see the need for this at all. If for some reason we ever had to use this source to fight a fire, you'd never drink it. It would ruin your whole water system, and it'd be millions of dollars of expense to try to get it back to where it was. So it really is a desperate situation where you have fires, there's not enough water available from trucks, and you need to pump out of the river. So it's hopefully something that never happens. But this plan would effectively, for, I've said 100,000, we think it'd be less. Just look at the parking lot that was abandoned down there, probably rip up all the pavement and just gravel it or dirt it, pack it down, probably not repave it, and just create, a lot more impervious surface. And either allow cars to go in straight behind the gate, which is towards the one of the old buildings, or potentially additionally take a right and possibly have some additional parking there. I don't know the exact number, but right now on Stroud Avenue, less than 10 cars can park, I think. It's about that, it's 8 or 10. From my observations, some of them certainly are professional dog walkers, because no one would have 20 dogs, I don't think, no one in Reading. So this would get all those folks off Stroud Ave, which the neighbors would be thrilled with. But much more importantly, and I've seen this, to take a dog or just a human and have them walk past the compost center on a Saturday is unbelievably hard.
Yep.
All parties are at risk, and luckily anyone that goes to the compost center enough knows this, but I always worry about the first-time visitor that just doesn't know. So we have made small improvements down there over time. You'd actually be surprised if you saw it before and after, because it still doesn't look like much. But this would really improve safety, I think, tremendously, and allow, if there's some other solution over the longer term, that's fine, but this would allow an immediate help. And by immediate, I think I mean possibly next summer, depending on when this gets funded. And also what conservation thinks, because we have not asked them yet, but we clearly would. So it's kind of a low-cost option to spruce up the place and to provide a much safer place for cars and dogs. There's the potential for improvements to the town forest entrance. It could certainly look a lot nicer. That's potentially part of this project. To me, it's not as urgent. The urgent thing is getting the cars parking in a more safer place.
Okay.
Yeah, that was my question. I've noticed over the years, there's now like a structure at the beginning of, it's a fence at the beginning of Stroud Ave. It doesn't look pretty.
Yeah, that's a sewer station. You don't want to remove that.
In the middle of the road?
Off to the side. It's in the corner.
Huh.
The pump station.
Is that what that is?
Yeah, it's been there a while, and it's
Couple
actually,
years?
it looks much more attractive now than 10 years ago, believe it or not. But that entrance could absolutely still be improved. I always like arches.
Mm-hmm.
It could just take away from what you see if you just made the rest of it a little bit more attractive for low cost. But I have to give DPW a lot of credit. It looks so much better than it looked 10, 15 years ago. But, their idea of landscape architecture and professionals might be different.
Yeah, a
so
little
I'm
bit.
sure more improvements
Okay.
can happen.
Because I'll help you take down that big rusty fence, like
Yeah.
over by the
Yeah,
gravel parking
that would
area
all
you're talking
change.
about.
All the fencing would go away. The sewer station still needs to have security around it. We don't believe that there'd be a reason to have a gate out there anymore. Now it's necessary to close the compost center. We think we can just secure the compost center with gates on each entrance and exit, and allow the public to maybe come in at any hour to this new parking area. Currently, when DPW goes home on a Friday at 3 o'clock, they lock the gate. So everyone that wants to use it for the rest of Friday or the weekend has to park on Stroud Ave and then walk. There's no other option. And that would go away. That would now
And also,
become.
we're skipping Grove Street. I always end up parking on Grove Street. That thing's always closed.
Oh, okay. Really?
So it's,
oh,
yeah, so it's both. I mean, I've never parked on Stroud. I've always
okay.
parked
Yeah, you're
on
right.
Grove.
You're right. It's Grove Street.
Oh,
That's
okay.
right. Yeah,
All right.
that's right. So, there's lots of potential benefits, and this is one of the lower cost items, and, we'd plan to do all the work ourselves. And then if the, community wants to make some suggestions on making the place a little more attractive, that'd be welcome over time.
Hey, Bob, I just want to stop. Mark's had his hand up for a little while, and
Sure.
it might have gone back to something else, but apologies, Mark.
No worries, thanks, Ed. I do want to go back to one quick thing on the water tank. I think your approach in terms of looking at options is spot on, trying to kind of understand what happened. But the other thing that struck me as you were talking is maybe the MWRA can be helpful to us in the procurement side, in terms of leverage or knowing of other places. Maybe, who knows, there's some community that just canceled something, Lord knows why. but just to kind of figure out from their perspective how they might be helpful to us, just might open up the options a little bit further. So that was just a quick comment on that. And then the second on the town forest, just kind of following up on Karen's comments too. And you mentioned, improvements for cars and dogs, but obviously for people as well. And I think moving people off of Grove Street and having a parking area back there and making sure that we provide easy access into the town forest. We already know that the usage is way up and lots of folks want to go in there. This is a great opportunity to help that along. And as you said, for pretty short dollars. So awesome. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark.
The next two items that are sort of more near term, I think last year was the first time DPW added some rock wall replacement lines, and they were 5 or 6 or 7 years out with specific places listed. Unfortunately, Memorial Park had an issue. I think a tree fell that started the issue, and the rock wall needed repairs, which they were able to do as much as was urgently needed. But in looking at Memorial Park walls more carefully, they said, we need to spend upwards of another $200,000, $180,000, I think, to really fix Memorial Park. So, after talking about it and after asking other communities, what do they do? And everyone does what we do, which is when it falls, we rebuild it. And there's no reason to ever do anything else. I don't usually like that approach. I like to be more proactive. But as we studied it, I thought, what tell us? The answer was they couldn't tell us very much. They could study all the conditions of all our rock walls today, and 6 months from now, most of those conditions would change, or many could change. So we did decide that a more appropriate approach is like the playground improvement program, just have money in every year. When you can identify, and certainly when town meeting is voting on something in the specific budget, you need to identify a location, or I'd want to. And to the extent you can plan out a couple of years in advance, that's so for now, the immediate need was to do more work on Memorial Park, and $100,000 was the request. And then you'll see in a capital plan, maybe we can do a little bit less for a couple of years, but $100,000 is a ballpark number. And this is something that, again, no community is planning. They just do it when they need to. And the work generally has to be contracted out. It's not something you can do from an expertise. And it's just one of those unseen things, until you have a weather event or an accident. You don't think about rock walls, you just enjoy them or not, depending on your taste. I grew up in Milton, which has a lot of rock walls, but most of those are private and not public. And that's the difference in Reading, is most of the rock walls you see here, we own. And lastly, our Birch Meadow site improvements, Birch Meadow Elementary School site improvements had been planned for, I think it was $200,000 next year. Just to let Tom try to regather his wits a little bit and not run away screaming, I thought we'd move that out another year because it's certainly not an urgent need for the schools. It was a safety improvement, but it's not an unsafe location. We again have looked at all the schools from this perspective and already repaired one, and this was the second one that was identified, and there's no others planned other than Killam would be if there were no long-term plans. Killam clearly needs some work also. I don't know if FINCOM or anyone wants to discuss future projects. Some of those have come up tonight in your previous discussion. Nothing is imminent or urgent in terms of, the next 6 months or say, or year. But I've tried to list some things that are in process, and there could well be other things I don't know about that just haven't really proceeded along a path. One thing I've learned in the last 2-3 years is, since I'm not a part of the right Facebook groups, there's a lot of things going on in town I don't know about. So sometimes someone will ask, well, why aren't you doing this? And I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. How could you not know? Well, the reason is because I'm not in that Facebook group. So I just want to remind the community that the town government and FINCOM and the elected boards can be as flexible as possible, but they do have procedures. There is a process by which capital projects are discussed and decided on, not by staff, but by volunteers. So to the extent that the community has projects they're thinking about and we haven't been told, and please tell us. And I'm sure once once a certain journalist in the room writes the article about all this free money, there's probably going to be one or two new ideas that'll spring up. But it's just really important, as Gene pointed out earlier, to have a disciplined approach and not just spend money kind of haphazardly and then wish in 3 years that you'd done something different. So I won't go over any of those, but at this point, I do want to remind you of the things that are not on the capital plan, which are on the screen. A lot of it is the Birch Meadow Master Plan is right about here. It's 9 to 11 million out of the 15 million, so it's a big item. There are other projects that are here, and then importantly, in this little box up here, doesn't look pretty, but that's just the way it fits in the capital plan. There are some larger projects, let's just kill them, that are not far enough along to really have a number. And these larger projects generally, the bigger ones had to be done with excluded debt by FINCOM policy. So I don't remember the exact number, but it was approximately a $3 million or $5 million project or larger. Your policy suggests that has to go to the taxpayers. You can always change your policy. Some can make an argument that we can afford it with other money, but to fit inside the tax levy, that's the policy. And just for those in the room that don't have the background that Chuck and I had, when we were on FINCOM, a lot of stuff was done inside the levy, and it crowded out just running a school or a town government. So we did repairs to 2 elementary schools, built a new elementary school, and most of that money was done inside the levy. And it just completely crushed capital spending and capital spending years. So the reason the FINCOM 5% policy was developed and the whole budget model is to allow a little bit more longer term thinking, I guess I'll say. None of this is a law. It's all a choice. And if for some reason the community decided to do a project that was $5 million and not ask the taxpayers, that's perfectly fine. You just need to think about how do you pay for it. So Killam, a community center, and I'm not sure what we do with the DPW garage anymore since our plan was nixed. Those were the biggest projects I could think of. If anyone has any others that are 5 million plus, which is a pretty big number, certainly I'd like to know sooner than later. But I just kind of encourage people as they leave the meeting and as people that are listening think about it, you try to work towards an organized solution because this could be chaos. Free money, excellent, sign me up. Again, my only opinion is get a sense from the town accountant of what's important from a time perspective. You don't want to miss an opportunity. And otherwise, just be cautious about doing something just because there's money. That's one thing that I differ from the last town manager. He loved grants. He would spend $4,000 of staff time to get a $1,000 grant and think that was good because we were all a sunk cost. Well, it depends how you look at it. I don't like that. I don't want to do something that I wouldn't normally want to do just because someone else is paying for it. If it's at the margin, that might decide it for me. But if it's something that we wouldn't have done, then we pass on grant opportunities. And I know not everyone thinks that's the right approach. But there's no such thing as a grant that doesn't cost at least staff time, significant staff time. I guess the last item I want to cover, just because it was news to me, I knew about the project, but the Voc School in Wakefield is scheduled to be replaced, I guess I'll say. $317 million is the latest cost, so that'll make whatever our estimate was from Killam look dirt cheap. There are 3 Voc schools, and they're all in this neighborhood, 300 to 325 million, so it's not unusual. It's a somewhat complicated system, as Voc schools are. They require I guess I'll say, they cannot have a negative vote from any of the 12 communities by December, by MSBA rules. And if they do, they have to take another path. So with all due respect, as much as I can muster, it's not in their best interest to be very transparent here. And they have not been, in my estimation. And I've had this discussion with them. Because if we don't vote no, they get a yes from Reading. And I'm not saying I oppose it, but I'm saying that, Jane Wellman was finally able to drag them in to town hall somewhat. And, I want this to be a community discussion, and I want this to be on November town meeting. I have no idea how. That's still a legal question. Is it a debt exclusion? I don't know. And I think vocational education is extremely important. But I think the way some vocational schools have operated in this state is completely beyond transparency and the public reach. There's 12 communities. We used to meet regularly. Several years ago, the then city manager of Chelsea, Wakefield, and myself and Peter and Reading met as a subgroup, and we effectively ended up putting them under state receivership because of their financial practices and lack of transparency. The state ran them for a couple of years. They sorted themselves out. They definitely have improved. But my point is, vocational education, while being academically very important and important as a society, does not nearly get the scrutiny that our school department does. And when you think of 12 communities with a school committee with one representative from each community, you can understand why. There's no real vested interest in a group of the public to keep an eye on this. There's no community. For our share of this debt, should we go that path in terms of debt, it'd be about $250,000 a year for 30 years. So within a multi-$100 million budget, it's certainly affordable by Reading, and I have no objection for paying that. It's good value. But for some of the communities that are paying $2 million a year for 30 years, they can't afford that, and they are looking towards this federal money as a potential help. Out of the $317 million, the local share is $177 million. And that's not because of bad reimbursement number, it's because of cost of construction, so another kind of market problem. The MSBA last spring, upon lots of begging and pleading, changed their allowable construction costs from something like $330-something a square foot to $360. The actual market price of current construction is $600 to $900 a square foot, depending on the details of the school. So, we do get reimbursed Chelsea's rate, which is the highest reimbursement, and it's just below 80%, but it's on a very lower base because the construction costs are not an eligible cost fully. So I just wanted to bring that to FINCOM's attention, especially. It's controversial in the sense that I make it that because of transparency. As a financial issue alone, it's really not a big deal. It's very affordable. We are at, I believe, an all-time high in enrollment for the Voc schools generally. We have 3 of them. This is the main one. I want to say we have, 33 students most recently in the Voc school and potentially a few more next year. And more typically, Reading had a dozen kids or so. And, one can discuss why that is, and there's probably no one reason. The pandemic was part of the reason, though, I've been told. And other Voc schools have also taken away some of our enrollment by offering special programs. They give a program a different name that the Wakefield school doesn't have, and then you, through school choice, can enroll your child at a different school. And the Wakefield school, in terms of cost per student, is far less than the other alternatives, for what that's worth. So, I would want to put vocational education on the map a little bit more for Reading to think about as a financial issue. I know both Toms have mentioned recently the need for our school district to think about vocational education. It's something I talked to John Doherty about over the years, and I just think it's just such a practical area, and now it's becoming a financial area where it never really was. That I'd welcome any discussion on this, and any solutions that are practical. Reading did try to think about getting out of the Wakefield School District before I joined, so it's almost 20 years ago, and that's not legally possible or easy, I guess I'll say. And I'm not sure why we want to. Vocational education in Wakefield has been tremendous from everything I've heard. But I can assure you that if we were thinking of building a $317 million building, it would have got a lot more discussion in Reading. And poor Stoneham is trying to do that. They're trying to build a high school at the same time, exact same time that this building is going on, for less money. So we're in a good shape that our buildings have been taken care of, and that so much construction was done, a decade or more ago. And that's why it's important. You can't be faced with all of a sudden lots of needs. You need to take care of them along the way.
Bob,
can I clarify? So we have an annual expense, we have an annual tuition expense per student, and I do recall after they redid Essex Tech that the rate almost doubled. It went up a lot. So it's not just this. But now because this is our district, so we have this capital responsibility, and we're going to have tuition on top of that, and we can guarantee the tuition is going to go up.
Yeah, and the only offset to that might be that their enrollment capacity will go up. It's like 1,250 now. It'll go up to 1,600, so they will have more sources of funds, I guess I'll say. But you're probably right. Tuition will tend to go up. My recollection of Essex Aggie was they were merging two schools, and they did not change the capacity like this one is trying to. And something that Sharon and I have run into recently is one of the other Vogue schools we use have started assessing us a capital charge without telling us what it is. How much was it? Like 15 grand a year or 12 grand a year, something like that?
It was like, I want to say like 6 or 7 grand.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, we had, I think it was 2 students, and they're charging us $6,000.
One student.
Oh, one student. I don't know what they're doing,
One
but they
student,
call it a capital
$6,000.
charge. So, that's why the community does need to start looking at vocational education a little better to just try to understand it. And again, I've had friends that their kids go, it's a tremendous education. Some of my colleagues at Town Hall have gone, and it's a tremendous education. That's not the question at all. The last topic really under this is land use. I've just listed a couple that I could think of. The Select Board did have a subcommittee on publicly owned land, I want to say 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago. So we provided them a lot of information, probably not in an easily digestible form. We own a lot of land. If the community wants to move forward and organize the land we own and study it more carefully, staff's in a position to do that. Oakland Road always comes to mind. Mr. Brown reminds me once in a while. The rink on the ice rink on Simon's Way, we bought 2 parcels, one behind the baseball field, kind of isolated, the other adjacent to the parking lot that's buildable and half not buildable. The Select Board has recently received a right of first refusal on some Grove Street land. They had a similar thing come up with a very small parcel on Northern Main Street. There is potentially a parcel behind that might come to the board in the future that's, I'm guessing, significantly more expensive than this one is. So, in terms of, public land, we should also look at the Chapter 61 land, which would include, for instance, Meadowbrook. So if Meadowbrook ever decided to just go out of business and sell, they have to offer it to the town first. Now, we couldn't really afford to buy the whole thing, but there is other pieces of Chapter 61 land around town that, maybe there should be a group looking at that more proactively. And, the school committee especially and the Select Board have talked about what they need for land, and that's a discussion that should also continue. I know it happened, especially centered around elementary school space and whether another elementary school should be built, early education center, and so on. So, land is, as my father always said, they don't make it anymore. We do own a fair amount of it. And there's a lot more open space in Reading than most communities. A lot of it's wet, so it's not buildable. But, as someone mentioned in conjunction with the work up at Camp Curtis, technologies and appetites change so that non-buildable land eventually becomes buildable. And I just kind of leave you with that thought, that as housing is needed, it will be built. And the open space you thought you had may not be as protected as you thought it was. So the town has to really be pretty diligent about, its land and its open space. And I don't see a need to discuss the warrant. We'll do that in due time. I'll certainly keep FINCOM apprised. We put in a couple of budget transfers and so forth. I don't think any of them need to happen before November. They can wait. That's not the reason you'd have a town meeting. If we do have a town meeting, we may as well throw some things in there. And that's really the whole financial overview I wanted to kind of provide you tonight. And I would encourage you to figure out a process for prioritizing, not only to spend the money you have, but some of these other bigger, longer-term items. This is a really nice opportunity to reset and to think about, what's the big picture look like? We're in much better place than some of us feared 18 months ago. No one has discussed operating override for a long time, but when we had one, it was discussed that we would need one in 5 years, and so we're due. I don't think we are from an operational standpoint, unless there's a lot of new costs that have to come in. But it's a good opportunity to really have that bigger discussion with many pieces to it, because the bigger discussion will take a couple of years, I think. So that's all I have for tonight. Thank you for listening.
Angela Binda, 10 Orchard Park Drive, and member of the Rec Committee. Bob, can we talk about Birch Meadow for a minute? Can you go back to the slide that you had? But before that, I want to say the Memorial Park rock wall is a WPA project, historic wall, so thank you for keeping it in good repair. So, as you probably know, after maybe 5 years, the Rec Committee, the Birch Meadow Master Plan Subcommittee, put together a final plan. I don't know if it was presented to FINCOM, it was presented to the Select Board. And there were so many groups that were involved with it: town administration, public schools, lacrosse, Little League, Conservation Commission. And like I said, it was years and years going on with surveys and outreach, public meetings. And then finally, staff was involved with a consultant. And what came out of it was focus areas. The key focus areas, the fields with lighting, passive recreation, restrooms concession, more turf, lacrosse wall, and it goes down. What's really nice about what the consultants did was, in their final report, they grouped projects into critical, sustainable, and visionary, and they also grouped them into costs, like $1 sign, $2 signs, up to $4 signs, potential for phasing, and potential for outside funding. And so the projects that Bob has up there, I think some of them might have been grouped together, and they're not necessarily in the same order that was considered, was order by the consultant. And I did read, Bob, I heard you speaking to the Select Board, and you did talk about infrastructure and how you like to start with infrastructure. And as far as critical goes, the projects, the top project that was considered critical, and actually only $2 signs, which they said low to moderate cost, $250,000 to $750,000, was the central spine and restrooms, which I think on your, is that under D, support and general circulation? Is that where?
I think it is, in addition to walking paths.
Okay, in addition to walking paths, okay. And what that is the central spine and restroom, so it improves circulation, and it would be a pavilion with shade and bathrooms. And that was the top thing, and it was potential for phasing was yes. And they estimated the cost at $250,000 to $750,000. The Recreation Committee voted on that as being their top priority and the project that they would like to see move forward first. So Bob talks about the parking, and I can understand that in one sense, but if you're talking about infrastructure. I would say that restrooms would also be considered infrastructure. And it rose to the top so many times what people were looking for. Like I said, lighting, feels passive recreation, restrooms, concession stands, and turfs. Those were the things that kept rising to the top. And so there would be a central path from the top all the way down. It would be a central spine, which would increase the walkability of it and also have lighting and a pavilion for shade and for restrooms. So that's under D. You've added other things to it. If you go to the Recreation Committee website, on there, you can look at the whole presentation and see what they consider critical, what is considered sustainable, and what is considered visionary. But as far as critical goes, that was the first thing: central spine and restrooms, circulation improvements. The lacrosse wall was second. Imagination Station parking lot was the third item, which Bob thinks is also very important. And then the stadium, which has a big ticket, but that was the fourth thing that they list as critical, and that seems to be what's being funded. But I don't know exactly how something gets onto the capital plan or how it gets put forth. I think that central spine, the pavilion, and the restrooms would be a really nice way for the town to kick something like the whole Birch Meadow improvements off. And the consultant also did a really good job of writing out, like, these are projects that could be broken up, these are phased in, and also what's the potential for outside funding, because a lot of these projects could have outside funding too. I just think that it would be such a nice way to start the whole Birch Meadow renovation things off. It might give people enthusiasm to start fundraising for more improvements going forward with it. So I don't know how something officially gets put on it, but I hope you look at that. I hope you consider that. And it's exciting to think about what might be coming down the line at Birch Meadow. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela. Any other questions or, go ahead, Jean.
Bob, I want to thank you for the very clear, not funded, and what we're looking at the screen right now, because I've actually heard from some town meeting members a desire to see this laid out. And it's all well and good to look at the capital plan, and it works out financially, and everyone goes, okay, that makes sense. And then you hear, well, wait a minute, did you consider X? And it's really good to be able to say, yes, we did. We looked at all of that. So I just wanted to thank you for this. It would seem to me that at this point, even rough numbers for the Vogue School in Wakefield should be in the debt projections.
You know, it's not clear to us whether it's coming to us as debt or an annual cost. And that's one thing I asked their bond counsel and their financial advisor, we use them both, is, for instance, just thinking outside the box, could Reading just make a lump sum payment up front to diffuse the whole 30-year payment? The 30 years, I'm going to try to do it from memory. I think it was over $3 million, including interest, and less than half that if you paid it up front. So again, I don't know. And if it was to be paid up front, it would clearly be capital. But otherwise, we think it comes along as part of the annual assessment for the Vogue School, even though it's capital.
So it may not even belong.
Yeah, it's not clear, but that's definitely a question I asked them. And like we mentioned earlier, we're getting a capital charge from another Vogue School that has nothing to do with the capital plan. It's just passed along as an operating expense per student.
Would there be a benefit of somewhere on this grid putting potential vocational school question mark, as in it may end up being here? I guess just trying to get it more on people's radar.
I don't see any harm in doing it that way.
Yeah, thanks.
And one other thing, so I know town meeting approved another $50,000 for consulting to decide into a pandemic, what do we really need at the Pleasant Street Center? And I imagine, I don't know, well, I'd love to know if you have any idea of how far along they are, but in getting to your topic about a placeholder, because I think out of that needs to come like smaller capital type projects like the first floor bathroom and whatever else they've been asking for a long time, versus if they come back and say they need a giant building, that is, that's a much bigger deal. But I think we're gonna see, whenever that gets finished, I think we're gonna see some things that could fit on this. Could we hold up, so right now, all I see is like community center, which is a really big item. So, will that study be done anytime soon?
I don't know if Mark, Doctor's still remote. He may know more than I do. I know some staff know, but Mark, what do you know?
I don't think I know more than you do. We did have the first meeting. Kevin, Bob, Gene, myself sat down to talk a little bit. I'm not sure kind of what the next step is yet. But I guess to Karen's point, there are some very strong needs in the senior community, and I think sorry, I don't know who it was. I had my screen on small. I think Carly brought it up also in terms of just the programming side. But there are also some needs that are going to go beyond that. And the notion of community center is kind of all-encompassing. It could be a senior center, community center. It could just be a senior center. I guess it could just be a community center as well. But the notion of what that is, I think we want to figure out and make sure that we're keeping that at a high priority. And we have no idea what kind of numbers would be involved here. So, I take your point. But I think it's a really high priority for the community to be considering at this point. The population of seniors, now defined as age 60 plus, is going up very quickly. And there are a lot of folks in town who fit that. There are a lot of programs and other activities we could do. And to Karen's point, our current senior center doesn't meet the needs of the community. And we need to figure out how to expand that. And again, whether it's a building or it's other use of facilities and programs, it's really high priority.
And thanks for that, Mark. And I think this touches on something Bob said earlier that I actually wrote down, really resonated with me, is this all speaks to the need for some sort of a bigger, longer conversation. One question is, do you build a whole new center or do you renovate the center you've got? But that needs to be part of a much bigger conversation, is how does Killam fit in with that? And the potential of another operating override down the line, it is a testament to the town that we're not talking about it now. But we will be talking about it in some period of time. And so there needs to be some method to get all of these in one place so that the community, town meeting and community members have some sense of a strategy as opposed to that. So I think maybe that's what you were getting at. You probably articulated it better than I just did.
I'm also thinking back to this building, and at the time, the discussion for a early education center and a library sort of randomly, if you will, came in. And, I can speak more to the library because I knew about that process. It did come out of nowhere one day. Now, it didn't come out of nowhere from the library staff that were involved. They knew, the trustees knew, but it hadn't been a much wider discussion until it was further along in their minds than it was in ours. And it's a beautiful building. I'm glad we built it. I'm glad we renovated it. But, I remember that's really why the Permanent Building Committee was created. Barry Berman had a long chat with me and others, and that's what his suggestion was, which is a good one, so that we have taken steps so that there can be avenues for these discussions. If any of the elected boards, such as the select board, wanted to build a new senior center, they have to go to the Permanent Building Committee first. That's the way it's set up. I think generally FINCOM has done a really good job filling what otherwise could be a void in having these discussions. And it can't be an elected board that only has a portion of the town, if you will. They can absolutely be vital partners, but they speak to their needs. FINCOM speaks to the whole picture.
Yeah.
Whether you need to spin off and form a subcommittee or find other volunteers to help, I don't know.
The FINCOM used to have a capital.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. Were you on FINCOM when that existed? I wasn't. You were? Maybe I was too. I just didn't remember. Was it like a couple members or bigger?
3 or 4.
Okay.
And can I add one more quick point that, again, it's not for discussion tonight per se, but in each of the financial forums over the last couple of years, we brought up the notion of what is the Community Preservation Act and could it do any good for the town of Reading? And several years ago when it was brought up, it was at a time when the state didn't have any funding for it, basically. So it wasn't a good thing to even consider. But what's happened since is that any of you who are in real estate or gone through real estate transactions, the fees were raised dramatically on those transactions, and the CPA now is fairly robustly funded. And it gives a community a lot of flexibility in doing different things. It can range from acquiring land, which Bob, you just brought up in terms of thinking about some of the medical property that's currently available. It also is being used to help folks that were kind of pushed out of housing, that their housing need. And I saw one community recently that was able to use CPA funds to help out with housing assistance. And I keep thinking about the Main Street property and the folks that were forced out. So the CPA is kind of an interesting thing that I'd like to put on the docket for talking about again. It's not saying, hey, you got to do it, but I think it's something we should be considering because it can help fund a lot of interesting kinds of things that are more the long-term kind of planning activities that we're talking about. And then last point I just want to bring in also, Bob, when did the high school and library come off of the debt payments? Is that 24 and 25?
That's about right, Mark. It's somewhere in the capital plan. That's about what I recall.
Yeah.
And the thinking was always that, much like the performance contracting, we start planning a few years in advance for the next big project, but obviously you do it sooner if you have to. But that was a natural fit for more excluded debt, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. And so as we're thinking about larger projects, I think it's important to understand that, you can't just kind of go on add. But with the ebb and flow of these things, as we pay for some of them, it may open up some opportunity for projects that we said, wow, it's too much. But suddenly realizing, well, wait a minute, the high school's coming off in 24. And 24 is right around the corner.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Anybody else? Tom, I know you just came back off video. Did you have something to add to or no?
No, just wanted to be here in case there was something that came up.
No problem.
You want to vote?
Do we need to approve minutes before we adjourn?
Yeah, so would you like us to leave and you guys can do the minutes?
Yeah.
I guess Ed, real quick before you do adjourn, do you want to do anything about the committee idea that was discussed and that people seem to get behind in terms of how to use some of the ARPA funds? Or is that something you want to think about for the later September/October meeting?
I don't know if, are we in a position where we could,
I'd like to sit with it a little bit, but especially where there isn't a huge time urgency on it. I just want to verify that.
No. There's
Yeah.
no time urgency right now.
I think we should keep it on the next agenda. That's just my 2 cents. I'd say keep it on the next agenda.
for a financial forum agenda, I think that's, I want to be able to do it in the forum because we'll have the select board and the school committee, and others, kind of present versus just one of our, because
Yeah, that makes sense.
you end up getting kind of a subset to our meetings, but at the forum, you end up having just a wider audience. So if we're going to table it, then I would suggest, go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, for your financial forum on October 20th, I'm going to also ask you, obviously the usual budget guidance, but that includes how much free cash to use. And I want you to give an opinion of should any of these funds be programmed into the next year's budget. I'm not going to assume that, but you need to tell me. So that is part of the October agenda, if you will, by default. I don't see any sense in rushing, if you will, unless Sharon finds out, oh, cripes, there's this one thing here that if we don't do it now, it can never be done. The water tank might be an example of that. So I will want to ask FINCOM when you give budget guidance, what sources of funds are there in addition to free cash, if any? And I'm going to assume, as I've done in this presentation, there is none, unless you tell me otherwise.
take it as almost homework for all three boards before the next financial forum to do some thinking about from the school side, the select board's guide, the FINCOM side, talk to other communities, how are they handling it, and then come ready to discuss all together about how we move forward.
Good idea.
Good work.
Glad I thought of it.
Yeah. If the schedule's too full, I understand. I would love to give an audience like that an update, like 30 minutes.
Sure.
Like, kind of like Sharon did. She just gave us the overview, just like start laying the groundwork, and we'll get ahead of this. We need to consider an operational override, and what are the offsets, or what are the other options we have? Okay. And if not this forum, maybe in the spring.
Yeah.
Depending on the time.
Do committees and boards want to
I would entertain,
skedaddle?
I would entertain a motion to adjourn the select board.
Motion to adjourn the select board.
Second.
Excellent. Okay, Mark, any
Yes.
discussion? Are we good? Okay, Mark says yes. Chris?
Yes.
Carlo there?
Yep.
Carlo,
Yes.
is Ann still with us?
Yes, and yeah.
And Karen, yes. The select board is adjourned.
Choose your own.
Sorry, thank you.
Charge you a toll.
Should be a bigger gavel of it. I think that is it. We only have like one.
Bob, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I had an extra, sorry.
Okay, extra.
Motion to adjourn.
Second?
Thank you. That's great.
Okay, Carla?
Aye.
Chuck?
Yes.
Aaron?
Aye.
Sarah? She's still up there? Sean?
Aye.
Okay, looks like we lost Sarah, so the school committee is adjourned. Thank you, Ed.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for
It's very good.
for joining.
It'll be interesting next time too.
You're looking for a motion on minutes?
We're probably going to need to sort of.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, because I don't think we have anything else in minutes.
Yeah. And we know.
Move to approve the minutes dated August 18th, 2021.
Second.
Boy, Mark.
God, it's 10 o'clock. Oh, so
All right, so I got to go to a vote. Joe, I'll start with you because you're online.
Yes.
Jackie.
Yes.
I probably could have done it with hands, shouldn't I? Or Jean, go ahead.
Okay, yes.
Mark? Yes. Jeffrey?
Yes.
That would be ugly.
Eric?
Yeah, that wouldn't be.
Mary Ann? Yes. And Ed, yes. 7-0 and an abstention. Do we have any other, any other business, anything else that we wanted to kind of go over?
When did we settle on the next meeting?
Go ahead, Bob.
I'll circle back to especially the chair and the vice chair, but all of you, with what the October town meeting plan is and what your meeting schedule, might need to change to if at all.
Yeah, that'd be helpful.
And we'll try to get that nailed down by next week.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that sounds
I
good.
did learn today from town council that, for instance, we can start a town meeting on a Thursday. It doesn't have to be a Monday, and I was never sure.
Yep.
So because there's a holiday in October on a Monday, we could start that Thursday. I forget the date, but I don't think we'd want to meet sooner than that. But I'll have more information for you as soon as I can.
Well, especially too, if you're going to do free cash, you need time for the, for Sharon to do free cash anyways, right?
Yeah, she knew it, well, very likely would not be certified by September 29th. She'll have to push if it's the middle of October. I don't think it has to be certified for us to know we got enough of it, honestly,
Yeah,
now that she's gone.
and I think that's what, this was helpful in that we're tacking towards better than worse. You know what I mean? And, kind of, so like not having kind of a certified number, I don't think it's going to make or break because we're heading in the right direction.
Yeah, when you had 4 million, then spending $1 million was a big discussion. When you have 12 million, then spending 2 million is not quite as imperative.
Granted, yep. Cool. Any other business from anybody on the committee? Then let's.
So just to clarify, you were saying at the beginning of the meeting that we're going to keep the meeting on September 13th, but maybe not the 30th, but then I heard Bob say we can't do anything on the warrant articles on the 13th, so maybe we should consider having the one on the 30th and not the one on the 13th.
Yeah, I mean, is that,
Maybe.
is that kind of what you're
Yeah,
thinking about?
I would say if FinCom has no other business other than the town meetings upcoming, that the 13th isn't
Yeah,
going to be
and I don't think
productive.
that we had much else, I don't think we had much other business. I mean, granted, there was a couple things that came out of this, but I don't think anything that would warrant us being on, to have a meeting on the 13th. So,
Well-
I agree with that. I think it's probably just better to move towards the 30th and the 13th.
Yeah, just to remind you of one thing that you discussed in the past, and I'm not saying I have an opinion on it. You did talk about whether to vote to move money into a stabilization fund, which does require a town meeting. So that's about the only kind of unfinished business I can remember FinCom having, but there's no reason you have to have that discussion. You had the discussion before the pandemic. There's certainly no urgency to it.
Yeah.
It was to reduce the free cash and the appearance of the free cash, being very large, and putting funds in a stabilization fund, which does not take a majority vote, but takes a 2/3 vote from town meeting to spend it. And our stabilization fund is $1.5 million, is significantly less than most of our peers, but our free cash is better. So, it's not a big deal to me. It's just money is money.
So-
I know FinCom had that discussion.
So related to that, Bob, can you just refresh the talking points on that piece of it, and especially around, if you have anecdotal of what the other peer communities are doing?
Well,
I think that might be
I
helpful.
can recall that this was when you folks decided to change your policy from, I'll say 5% to 7%, and there was more detail behind that in terms of we must have this much free cash. Then you discussed, well, what do we do with amounts that are higher than that? And one possibility is, well, we could move it into a stabilization fund, or otherwise known as a rainy day fund. Free cash isn't really a fund. It's just there. It's the change in the couch. It's more accessible. It's more useful. Most of our peers have a more thought out stabilization fund, and then free cash kind of goes up and down at much lower amounts as it will. But they don't tend to use it as part of a balanced budget process. They might have a capital stabilization fund, which might even fund a large percent of the capital plan in a year. And that's the way they do it. It's getting to the same place that we do, so I don't have a strong feeling, but I just remember you having that discussion. And the fact that, the temptation for an inexperienced person or group would be, you have X number of millions in free cash, can you go spend it on this? Well, no, we can't. We need to save it for a rainy day, some of it. So that's just the discussion you had pre-pandemic. I don't know if it's appropriate to bring it up again in a hurry, but where you're going to be talking about bigger issues and longer term planning, it fits in there.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a worthy discussion, and again, one of the things that just kind of pops, kind of straight in my mind is that there's a looming change come February, and with that, that there's a level of kind of philosophy and discipline that might be different, and I think that's that's what would lead me to say, okay, well, kind of given that, then having kind of more policy and structure kind of lends itself to making some of that transition a little bit more feasible.
Yeah, I'm not moving out of town though, so I won't be far.
Well, Bob, we're going to wrap. I don't know if you know it yet, but we're wrapping you in bubble wrap. So I don't know if you're going to be able to get out of here, tonight or any other night.
You have to change your phone number.
Exactly. Exactly.
I may do that.
Wise. Very wise.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that would be helpful, Bob, if just on just to be able to kind of rekindle that, because I think the only person that probably was part of that was Eric. Outside of that, I don't know if anyone else was, and I wasn't paying attention pre-pandemic. There's no chance. So yeah, that might be helpful on the stabilization fund. I think to kind of get us all up to speed.
Yeah, we could, whenever you next meet, we, meaning Jackie, can just go back and find your old minutes for discussions as the simplest reminder.
That'd be good.
And I'll see what I have.
That'd be great. Cool. Anything else for anybody? Chat under 3 hours?
Move to adjourn.
Out of way.
Second.
Thanks, Mary Ann. Bob, since we're in person, is it just hands, except for Joe?
You got to do a roll call.
Damn it, Joe.
We have a quorum in person, right?
I thought everything was roll call, if there was anyone.
Yeah, you're supposed to.
Like,
Oh, if anyone's not, then it's roll call.
I thought so.
But if Joe suddenly disappeared,
I don't want that. Joe,
which
go
I can
ahead.
do with one little touch of my finger.
Yeah, sorry, I promise I'll be in person.
No, Joe, don't worry about it. We're not heading that direction.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joe. Jackie?
Yes.
Jean?
Yes.
Mark?
Yes.
Jeffrey?
Yes.
Eric? Mary Ann?
Yes.
Ed, yes. We're adjourned.